Eschatology is what? I forget what I wrote. Is inseparable from religious faith. Like, how dare you advocate Christopher Hitchens? Well,
who said that?
I'd said that. That's probably what the thumbs down is.
Well, if you have time to give a thumbs down, then A, you are bored and have too much free time, and you contribute nothing to society. So
it's probably a Russian bot, though, right? Isn't it the Russians that are ruining everything?
No, it's probably a Lutheran.
It's from. Do we have Lutheran bots?
Yeah, they're called confessionals.
I will thumbs down your program.
They're drones. The drones in Sector C have been released.
What was that? That's a great Muse song, isn't it? The Drones one?
Drones, yeah. That entire album is actually about his divorce.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's a true story. The entire album is about his divorce from Kate Hudson, and then he just framed it against the backdrop of government surveillance.
Of warfare and military surveillance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a metaphor for his relationship with his wife.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I didn't know he was married to Kate Hudson. Look at that.
Yeah. They had a couple kids together. Yeah.
That's too bad.
So everybody's here for the live, but...
Let's see, who do we got? We have Melody, Steve, right?
Steve.
He just goes by S. Simon. That's his surname, Simon, like Peter. Peter's surname, Simon.
That's right.
I was trying to figure that out this morning, because that's how it is in Acts. I'm like, I thought his surname was Jonah, Bar Jonah, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, how's he surnamed Simon?
Simon Bar Jonah, yeah, son of Jonah, yeah.
So I thought that's what a surname was. It was your father's name, right?
I think so, right?
It's in Acts 10. They call him Simon, surname, or Peter's surname, Simon.
Maybe he's just a nonconformist.
Maybe Luke didn't get it right.
He's like, I'm free in Christ to take whatever name I want. I self-identify as Simon.
That's funny.
So today, as you know, we should probably hit record first.
Okay, rolling. I'm not glitchy this week, right?
No, you're not. And I paused Dropbox, so I think we're.
Oh, I should do that too. Let's do that too. Pause, sync indefinitely. Okay. All right. Work champ.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Banned Books Podcast, episode number 971, and we are your host, Christopher Gillespie.
Chillin' and willin', maxin', relaxin'. I've got the Delta variant, I think.
I'm sorry for you.
Little sniffles today.
I'll try and carry on without you.
I think I'll make it. I'm pretty sure.
I don't know if everybody if you could all pray for Gillespie and the Delta variant.
Or maybe we should call it the. What are they going to do when they run out of Greek letters? We'll call it the G variant. No, not G.
Maybe they'll do it like hurricanes. They'll just start naming the variants after people.
Oh yeah, so it's the Gillespie variant. We'll just call it that then.
Because it's all made up anyway, so you might as well just be like.
Well, we can't.
No,
but we.
This variant of the virus actually originated with Steve, so we're going to call it the Steven variant.
Did you read the Pfizer shareholder meeting letter where he says, I think it was Pfizer. Yeah, it was Pfizer. It wasn't Moderna. Pfizer guy said, well, we're looking forward to all the variants because then we can move away from pandemic pricing to our regular pricing for all the booster shots to cover the variants.
I read that and I didn't share it because it sounded like a LARP.
Like $170 a dose instead of $20?
No, just the whole syntax and the whole transcript. I was like, somebody had to have made this up.
Oh, that he was actually like encouraging
the wording and everything, just the way that it was, like the speech patterns and the syntax. I'm like, are these adults talking? Because it sounded like if two kids in their basement with like oversized hoodies and sweatpants were like writing a fake transcript for this.
You don't usually get excited about there being variants of a virus that might be more deadly.
You do if you want to buy a new yacht.
Then you can spend a lot of money on Amazon Prime Day. Okay.
There you go. Which national holiday is that?
Today.
It's every day. Amazon Prime Day is a national holiday every day.
Somebody did a study I was looking at this morning with regards to Amazon and found that Prime pricing, they've inflated all the prices intentionally.
Correct.
And then they subsidize it with the Prime. And you're like, wait a minute. So you got just as much money out of us, but free shipping.
Yeah.
Free 2-day shipping. Oh, I see how that works.
Yeah.
You mean you're not actually losing money? It's not a loss leader? No, it's not a lost leader.
No, especially when you don't have to pay taxes.
Delta 8. Oh, Delta Force? That was a great movie,
I like
right?
Delta Force. Maybe we should just start doing that. Naming the different strains after 80s action movies.
Wasn't that one
Commando
that
strain.
invented spandex for men?
Which
Was
one?
that Delta Force? No, I'm thinking of another movie. It was a movie where it was kind of sci-fi, and they were all the men were wearing these spandex
Running Man.
outfits.
The Running Man with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jesse the Body Ventura. The Running Man.
Is that the one where they
yeah,
were?
Richard
where they
Dawson. Where they all wear spandex and they have to run through the streets and avoid all the other.
Yeah,
fighters.
that's it. Okay.
Yeah, The Running Man.
Things that you'd rather forget, actually, but oh well.
It's a classic.
There it is.
It's a classic.
Okay. So we've either scared you off at this point, or now you're 100% in.
Hopefully we've scared off all the riffraff, the flotsam and jetsam, the hippies and the squares, the cats and the kitties.
The confessional trolls.
The confessional trolls. I'm a grumpy old troll who lives under a bridge.
Oh, gee.
That's from Dora the Explorer. I have a 3-year-old, so I'm reliving 18 years, by the way, going on 18 years of watching Dora and Diego's adventures. So now my 3-year-old thinks that I'm clairvoyant because I can predict what's happening next and quote from memory every single line. Well, because every episode is the exact same episode.
Right.
It's the exact same plot. Right? So she just looks at me when I say things. She's like, how do you know? I'm like, Jesus.
That's good.
So today then, we're going to dive back into Christopher Hitchens, get back on board the Hitchens train, and get back into this speech that he made in front of what was the official name of the group?
We Hate God Conference?
Freedom from Religion Foundation, 1999.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Or otherwise known as the We Hate God Foundation. Yeah.
I'll link it there in the chat.
The 30th Annual National Convention of the Freedom from Religion Foundation at the Monona Terrace Convention Center in Madison, Wisconsin.
It's kind of a misnomer, though. I mean, you can't ever really be free of religion.
Nah, you just invented a different
one. Yeah. Well, maybe that is less obviously religious, maybe? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We just call it secular.
Right. Or, yeah, civil religion, secular religion. I guess it's a form of folk religion if you think about it.
Everybody's got to serve somebody, right? We've quoted that a few times.
Yeah. So this is the 4th challenge then. If you want to read about or listen to the other 3, go back and listen to the previous 2 episodes. But this is the 4th challenge then he brings up in relation to religion and thinking about religion and the place of religion in society and how it's immoral and unethical and so forth. So he says, we have religion in our midst, even in our minds. We know where it comes from for an excellent reason. Religion is the first, and is in some ways, therefore, the worst, chance to explain human nature and the natural order. It was our first attempt at philosophy, just as it was our first attempt at astronomy and biology. We embarked on it in a time of fearful infancy, when we did not know that we lived on a rounded planet in a tiny solar system, which had a center around microorganisms that we could not see. Did I skip? A center around which we revolved. It did not revolve around us. Religion used to preach that mantra. We did not know that there were microorganisms that we could not see. But that explained a lot about both our health and our ill health. We were told we were given dominion over all animals, and we were wrong, because there were no dinosaurs in that list. No marsupials, because the people who wrote this did not know they existed. And we were certainly never given dominion over microorganisms, and we will never get that because they rule.
Microorganisms rule. That'd be a good t-shirt.
Right?
Isn't that true? Isn't that what we learned about a virus?
Yes, we did. His, how to put this, his arrogance in this paragraph is remarkable.
I wondered if it's intentional.
It could be, to provoke.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's...
Well, we talked about this last time at the end, that in the beginning of this, he was very witty, he was very charming, very, kind of tongue-in-cheek almost, like winking at the crowd. And then he kind of turns a corner and becomes acerbic. And now he just is like, this is the way it is, and this is why this is dumb.
Right, but remember his audience. I mean, these are like-minded people.
Right.
So when he just paints with this super broad brush about religion, quote unquote,
no one's going
to
challenge him. No one's going to challenge him.
Nope. But I think it's subversive too. I don't know. We'll see if it is. In that he wants people to be, I think he wants the hero to be much more specific.
Right.
Right. And so he clearly goes after created order as given in the Christian scriptures, right?
Right.
It's not just, not every religion says dominion over creation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, maybe they implicitly, believe that, but, that's
also,
quoting the Bible.
One, it's a uncritical use of the word dominion, because that's not what the word dominion means in the original Hebrew. It doesn't mean to lord over
rule
creation or rule creation.
Right.
Actually, my Hebrew professor said that the image is of stomping out grapes to make wine with. Essentially, it's a image of like using something to make something that you would then give to somebody else.
Yeah, transformative maybe.
Yeah.
Or no, that's too far, because now we're getting into changing of a thing.
That's
but
true,
rather, good use of a thing.
Yeah, good use. Using these grapes for what they are proposed for, which is to make this in order to serve it to others.
Like the psalmist says, right? Wine gladdeth the heart of man.
Yeah. Whereas I think we think of dominion in terms of like dominus, like to be master over something, to domineer, to dominate.
Oh, you mean to like put silver oxide in the clouds so it doesn't rain, or so it rains where we want it to? Okay.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That too. And so I think that, and it's also the myth of progress. And I think you talked about it last time or two episodes ago, the modern, and I guess it's always modern, but the assumption that we are more advanced than any civilization that's come before us.
Oh yeah, I did. That was the last one.
And it's not the myth of progress. It's the arrogance, historical arrogance, historical hubris.
I quoted the C.S. Lewis, right?
Yeah.
Chronological snobbery.
That's it. Chronological snobbery. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that because Nietzsche calls it the curse of history, which is that we are obsessed by history and therefore captivated by history, and yet history teaches us nothing about ourselves in the present tense.
No, it's true.
And so we linger on history because we think by looking over our shoulder, which is ironic in my experience, just because of going through recovery. And one of the first things that we learn in recovery is yesterday doesn't exist, tomorrow doesn't exist. There's only the present tense. And so if you live always thinking about what happened yesterday, you live with regret. If you live always worrying about tomorrow, you live with anxiety. And that the past literally doesn't exist anymore. It's not real. It only exists in your memory, and same for the future. So then the bondage of history, and I mean both backwards and forwards, is you live in a time and in a place with people and events that don't exist anymore, or they haven't occurred yet. And
whatever we know of them, it's ultimately unknowable. I mean, we were talking about, like, I was thinking about our children, right? And I've got an infant, you've got a young one, and you look at them and you're like, now that you have older kids too, you look and you're like, you have absolutely no idea what's going to happen with this child.
I don't know what they're thinking.
But you don't know what they're going to grow into.
No,
what their interests are going to be. You might guess, and you might guess even correctly, but you can't predict any of that. It's unknowable.
No, I was just talking about that with someone last week because, again, a parent, and discussing the fact that you can look at a 4-year-old and you don't think to yourself, in 20 years, I'm going to be visiting this person in jail because she's going to prison for 25 years. You don't think that. And even take away environmental factors. Let's say the person grows up in a suburban area in a cul-de-sac, has essentially, quote unquote, all the benefits of her upbringing. And so there's nothing that would indicate that she'd become a criminal when she gets older. And then she does. And you're flabbergasted by it because, of course, it's not that it happened. It's that the fact that you front loaded her future for her with all of these expectations and hopes and dreams that aren't real. So then when she becomes a criminal and gets arrested and goes to prison, you have this big basket, this treasure chest full of false hope, false dreams, false expectations that were never real.
Right.
And yet you're still clinging to them as if they were real in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so you couldn't see her slipping into it. You couldn't see her wallowing in it. And therefore you couldn't see when it reached that kind of terminal velocity of like, no, she's either going to end up dead, crazy, or in prison because that's her life choices.
I mean, I think the only thing that we can have any confidence, and I think this is a hard one to even then, is, when, what does the Old Testament scriptures say? Train a child in the way they should go and they won't depart from it.
Yeah.
And that's God's promise. It's not ours. And we look at that and we're like, seriously? I mean, we know lots of, teenagers that leave the church. We know adults that leave the church, and it's not because we didn't try to teach them,
right?
Or train them in the way they should go. And then of course you can do the blame game, right? You can say, well,
look at David's relationship to Absalom.
Well, arguably David wasn't really all that well trained himself, but
that's what I'm saying though, is that
he lacked discipline.
We willfully edit our parenting. So that when something does happen, like a palace coup, and then we can say, I didn't raise you to do this. How could you have done this?
Wait a minute. You killed a man so that you could take his wife?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you'd already taken his wife, and then you killed him. And
remember when I came to you about your daughter, my sister, and how I wanted to seek revenge? And you're like, no, man, we have this political treaty. We can't do that right now. It's not. You be patient. Remember that, Dad? Yeah.
Right. So maybe we're not good at admitting our own shortcomings, after the fact, because we edit our own history, as you said.
Well, yes. And like Nietzsche points out in the study of history, we edit history and we pick and choose. And especially in his critique of Socrates and Plato, he's like, listen, let's pay really close attention to Athenian society and what was happening when Socrates and Plato come on the scene and become super popular. And let's really look at history and why they've remained so popular amongst philosophers and theologians throughout the centuries. Let's be honest. Yeah. And not engage in this kind of chronological snobbery or this kind of myth of evolutionary progress, and recognize that generation after generation after generation, we keep repeating the same things, because even though we're slaves to history and do so willfully, we do so that we don't have to confront the present tense and accept responsibility for reality and the consequences of our choices.
Well, and it can be a wonderful coping mechanism personally, right? Because if you suffer trauma, you want your subconscious to forget, to hide that from you.
Right. But also, again, when it goes wrong, it leads to things like, well, we have to pay people money for something that happened over 200 years ago that none of us had anything to do with.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and the corporate thing too is that you are doomed to repeat it because you just selectively edit.
You're a consumer.
Yeah, but I think it's also about pride and trying to maintain your reputation. I mean, think about that slogan, "Make America Great Again," and I always questioned it because I'm like, when was America great? Right. No, that's not the history I learned. Now, maybe some people did learn some history where America was terrific. I don't remember that one. No, maybe that's because the history I was taught was selectively edited, and they omitted the best parts of it. And I need to do.
I was taught research. The positivistic history in elementary school, and then my dad taught me history from his perspective as a Vietnam vet and as a history major in college who went on to teach history. So I got the both sides of the street, so to speak.
Yeah, well, my history teacher was in Amnesty International in high school,
nice.
So. That tells you, maybe politically.
So like on the one side of the street, you go to school and you hear, well, George Washington's teeth were made out of wood or ivory. And then you go to the other side of the street and it's like, no, actually they were made out of the teeth of slaves. That's how they made dentures. They pulled slaves' teeth and then they made dentures out of them. And so his teeth were actually...
Store-bought?
They were store-bought slaves' teeth, yeah. Mm-hmm. And you're like, oh, that's gross. It's like, yeah, that's why they don't teach you that in third grade.
Just like we talked about a long time ago, the history of gynecology.
Yeah, exactly, same thing. Awkward, yeah. But if you are honest about the study of history and honest about history, the fact that George Washington made teeth out of the teeth of people that he owned, that's actually a really common practice.
Yeah, it's not just American Revolution era. This goes back a long way.
It goes way back, way back.
Well, slavery is not, and then you get into issues with slavery. I mean, it's not really condemned in the Bible, which is also awkward.
Well, neither is polygamy.
No, I know.
Neither is killing people and annihilating them for believing in different gods.
Yeah, they do have that as well.
Yeah, there's some awkward conversations.
This is all awkward.
Yeah, so
let's read Hitchens.
To Hitchens' point, though, he does bring that stuff up. And he shoves it in their face and says, listen, Judeo-Christian people, you good moral people.
Let's see you have dominion over the virus.
Let's talk about slavery.
Oh yeah.
And Christians are like, what? That's the Old Testament. He's like, oh, so you're going to pick and choose buffet style from the Old Testament, the stuff that you think is moral and the stuff that you think is immoral. Why don't you just own all of it and acknowledge either A, your God commanded it to be this way, or you're picking and choosing stuff to support your own agenda or cause?
Yeah. And the patriarchs, I mean, like, what's the difference between Jacob and Esau, for example?
Right.
They both married multiple women.
Correct.
The only difference is Jacob just chose his women from the people that his fathers told him to get him from.
But she wasn't a winner. Let's be honest. She wasn't a winner. She wasn't any more virtuous than Esau's wives.
Well, Esau's were Hittites, so, I mean, that was...
Yeah. And they worshipped false gods.
Right, exactly.
Just like Jacob's wife. Come on, people.
Oh, yeah, that's right. She had household gods, too.
She stole her dad's gods.
Yeah, menstruated on him. That was a beautiful story. I love that story.
So, yeah, those Hittite girls. Yeah. I mean, they're not as virtuous as
Bathsheba, right? I mean, she wasn't.
That too. Remember how you killed my husband to marry me? So, yeah, remember then how you promised my son would be king? Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hey, Solomon, I talked to your dad before he died, and he really wanted me to reinforce for you that you need to murder every political rival he ever had, including the rest of his family.
Universal. Are you Christians?
I like that. Are you? Some days.
Mostly.
I'd
like to believe so, anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. That's a good question.
Yeah.
So religion is the first, Hitchens says, and is in some ways, therefore, the worst. Chance to explain human nature and the natural order. I guess you have to ask then, what is religion? How do you define religion? But we'll get to that another time.
Yep.
So we didn't know that there were microorganisms. We talked about that. So skipping down now, we were baffled by climatic and cataclysmic events, earthquakes, tidal waves, storms, lightning. All of this was to us terrifying. Religion works as an attempt then to make sense of things. We are pattern-seeking mammals after all. It's a good thing that we are, because if we weren't pattern-seeking mammals, our curiosity would have no outlet, and we would not be capable of the great innovations that have liberated us from so many things, including religion.
What? So we looked at the birds and then we decided we could fly too? Is that what he's going to say?
It is argued by some, well then, give it some credit. The late Stephen Jay Gould said, let's consider religion in one corner and the study of science and reason in another. Consider them non-overlapping magisteria. One does one does the other. There's no need for a conflict. I think this has become, especially with the extraordinary revolution that we've been through in the last 20 years or so in the human and natural sciences, with the work of Richard Dawkins and Steven Weinberg, Daniel Dennett, Carl Sagan, Stephen Hawking, of course, and many others, a point where we have to say, no, this stuff is incompatible. In fact, I prefer to say irreconcilable with reason, acquisition of knowledge, and recent deployment of it. Yeah.
I think that's a good point. Mm-hmm. You know, because this is the thing we struggle with, you know, as pastors often, right? Is that people say, well, there's my religion and it's in this little area over here. Mm-hmm. And then there's everything else, and that's over here, right? And they don't really, and they're like what did he say there? Quoting Stephen J. What's his name?
Stephen Jay Gould.
Right, non-overlapping magisteria. That one is like, I'd say, you know, the faith governs the soul, right? Mm-hmm. And then then reason and strength governs the body and life,
right?
And then we have these weird things that happen in the church where we say, you know, here's this body and blood of Christ, and it's to strengthen both body and soul. And you're like,
right.
Oh, wait a minute. What does it have to do with my body? Well, one, you eat and drink it, of course. But more than that, forgiveness actually has not just spiritual benefit, but bodily benefit.
Right. Well, we've talked about this, right? Where you individuate the three parts that make a person whole, a whole person.
Body, soul, spirit.
Body, soul, and mind, or body, soul, and spirit. And that's a Greco-Roman move, not a Hebrew move or a Near Eastern move. And so the recognition of these three parts, just like the Trinity, these three parts make a person a whole person, and they're not individuated. They intersect, they complement each other. They're one each of a whole person. And so rather than take the human and divide them into body and soul, for example, in a Platonic or a Neoplatonic way, which is a very obviously modern move too, following that tradition. Rather, you embrace the whole of the person and recognize that in the eating and the drinking of the body and blood of Christ, in faith, what you recognize, or what we teach then, is you're feeding the body, the soul, and the mind simultaneously, because all three are what make you you. And the entire purpose of Christ's death and resurrection is the restoration and the redeeming of the person, the sinner. Not one aspect, one individuated piece of you, but the whole of you.
Right.
And you saw this with the scientific enlightenment in the Industrial Revolution and what comes after that, which is, like you said, well, the body now becomes the property of the scientific method and the Enlightenment. But that we still have the soul. And then Freud comes along and says, no, that the soul, that's just the mind. That's just the ego, the id, the superego, and so forth and so on. And so Christians withdrew from the conversation about the body. Then they were pushed out of the conversation about the mind, or the suke, the soul. So that in the present tense, like we were talking about, up until very recently, clergy were leaders. They were considered both pastoral, in the sense of spiritual fathers or spiritual leaders, but also community leaders, local leaders. Because at the very least, they were considered an educated opinion on matters of public morality, social law.
You can actually see this statistically in our own church body. I don't know about others, but in ours, is that the birth rate among pastors tracks the birth rate in the congregations, except in advance by about 10 to 20 years.
Right.
Right. So over the last 100 years, the families have gotten smaller, quite a bit smaller, right? Less than replacement rate now.
Right.
And the first people to do that were actually the pastors, and then the people followed suit. Because and that's public morality. It's kind of hard to say it's the Bible's morality. I think the Bible does encourage people to be open to children.
A little bit.
But on the other, yeah, right. And obviously you and I believe this, to a varying degree. What was I going to say? But I think it's interesting because this is what, 1996? Is that right? 97?
No.
Somewhere in there?
No.
It's later than that?
Yeah. The speech, you mean? 1999. I'm sorry. Yeah, 1999.
Yeah, the speech is 1999. So, now, who is it that's got the number one meditation app available, like on iOS, Android? It's he was a radical atheist. What's his name?
Sam?
Yeah, Sam Harris.
Yeah.
So Sam Harris comes along and says, well, you know what? I hate religion. Religion's terrible, and it's responsible, just like we're reading here from Hitchens, responsible for all this death, et cetera, et cetera. Never mind, obviously, other religions like communism. But then he comes along and says, but I recognize that, again, what it's trying to fill in, the gap it's trying to fill in, which is, he's doing a God in the gaps thing here, by the way,
Yes.
is that the spiritual discipline of meditation is still beneficial, even if we can get rid of all of the God part of it, which I think is naive anyway.
Yeah, he calls it mindfulness or mindful meditation.
Right. Well, it's very selfish too, but that's another story.
Right.
But it is interesting, right? Because he's become more spiritual. So you recognize that there is spirit and that there is a need for it to be not only trained, but also, there's beneficial practices, disciplines, habits,
Right.
that are reflected in many traditions, not just the Christian tradition, but other traditions. I mean, it's kind of like I was thinking the other day about fasting, right? And that Christians, just like Jews before, would fast on feast days and around holidays or during times of penitence.
Right.
You think of like Nineveh, right? The whole place is fasting. Why would you fast? And they're like, hey, you know what? Science actually has something to say about this today, right? With ketosis and what it does to your brain and your neurons and the way that these things work. And it increases,
Excuse me.
it changes your brain activity, right? And your brain operates differently when you're in ketosis.
So does that then, to his point then, does that essentially, that knowledge negate religion or negate metaphysics because we now, quote unquote, know the scientific answer to this primitive question?
I don't think so. I just think, I think he's right. They don't overlap. Or that they do overlap, that they're not distinguishable, although he's trying to just reject it entirely and saying, what we now know by science, we can see why why they had this, they didn't understand how it works, so they made it religious. That's what he's saying, right?
Right.
They didn't understand that ketosis had this, brain biological chemical thing that was kind of helpful at times.
Right.
And so they added this whole spiritual component on top to explain it.
Right.
What they couldn't explain, just like they did with viruses and disease.
Just like they did with Thor.
Oh, with lightning and thunder?
No, in Thor, in the actual movies, they explained the magic of Asgard as being just science. Like magic is just science that you haven't caught up to yet.
Which Thor was that?
Which one was that? Was that
Ragnarok, or was that the second one?
Good question. Somebody who's
The
watched
second
Thor
one,
more than I have.
I've only watched the second
Tell
Thor
me that.
movie like once because it was not my favorite.
I
We
think
watched
just talking
Ragnarok
to you on
again.
This podcast is. I think you've given me the Delta variant. I think it's gotten to me. Like
Oh, yeah.
I was
No,
fine
it
before I
comes
started
through
talking.
electronics.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll have to drink some kidney tea or meditate. I'll meditate the bacteria away.
So this is what he's doing, God in the gap. So there's things we can't understand that now we can explain by science, right?
Correct. Right.
Maybe we couldn't. And so religion was just filling in that gap to
Right.
try to explain the unexplainable.
Right. Right.
It's pretty common, I think, amongst the atheists.
Right. Well, what happens then? Because we were talking about this in relation to the accepted science of the 50s and 60s with lobotomies, as an example. And now we know sticking a swizzle stick into somebody's eye and swirling it around in your frontal lobe is not a good thing. It does damage. And that just because you have postpartum depression or you're hyperactive doesn't mean you should be lobotomized. And I don't really know many doctors or scientists or researchers who would argue that lobotomies should still be practiced today. And
It's
so
kind
you
of
have,
like how they used to treat hysteria, right?
yes, right, exactly, same thing. And so research and updates with technology and the ability to probe deeper into these questions and discover more allows then a scientist applying the methodology to say they were wrong. They didn't have access to this information, or they didn't have this equipment. Again, like Isaac Newton. Newton didn't have access to the kind of telescopes that we have today. And therefore, what he was capable of formulating is remarkable in its own right. And yet, he was wrong about a lot of his postulations because he just didn't have the technology available to him to go.
The raw data, you might say.
Right. Yeah, the raw data. So in religion, we call that repentance. And in science, it's recognizing, okay, the methodology is sound, but yet the data.
New hypothesis, right? We need a new hypothesis that takes in the data. And some of those are quite crazy, like string theory or something like that.
And I think what we encounter in both religion and science then, when science becomes scientism and becomes dogmatic, is the refusal to repent based on the latest data.
Well, yeah, we could talk COVID there, right? Yep.
We could. I was just about to. And like last year, just if St. Fauci or anybody else had just come out and said, listen, at the beginning of this is the data we had. But now we have more data. And so based on the new data, we're going to reform our opinion, and this is where we're at. And then, of course, with the emails coming out and everything, that kind of shot that in the foot.
Well, he was doing it. He just wasn't doing it publicly.
Or honestly.
Right. Well, yeah, one email to the next, one person to the next. It wasn't being
once
consistent.
you get caught in, even if it's not a lie, even if it's just obfuscation or withholding information, when that gets exposed, a lot of people whose lives are ruined are going to be, I think, arguably upset by that and ask, why didn't you just acknowledge this at the outset so that we knew this?
So you just put another lie on top of it then.
You put a lie on top of a lie, and then everything after that is suspect. And so I think his point is, he's close, in my opinion, to being correct. But like you said, the non-overlapping magisteria, we would argue, in the two kingdoms, in the formulation of the two kingdoms doctrine within Christianity, would be an overlapping magisteria.
Yeah, we'd say they don't reject the spiritual, but actually let it sit. Maybe not on top. I think they're just intertwined in a way that you can't separate
like I said,
them.
With the three aspects of human being, body, soul, and mind, they don't necessarily overlap, but again, they're not individuated either. So how do you explain that rather than to just say, listen, there are three parts that make you?
Well, I was thinking Luther's third article of the Creed, our favorite explanation, I'd say, from the Catechism, where he makes that distinction, right? That you can't by reason or strength believe. So there is a distinction between, the religious and the scientific. You don't believe in science. You might trust science. I don't even think you can do that because science always it has to be subject to rigorous cross-examination. Right? It's constantly under the dialectic. You're always taking what. Right. I mean, that actually is a place to be dialectical, right? You say, here's what I know. Here's the new data. All right, can I reconcile it? If I can't, do I need to destroy the first,
Well,
or is there a better theory, or does it need to be modified?
I brought this up in the sermon. Francis Bacon, who formulated the scientific method, said that the
Mm-hmm.
number one, like, overriding principle that should govern all scientific method is skepticism.
And we talked about skepticism in the last episode, didn't we?
Yeah. Is that you should
And
be
I made that
skeptical.
argument that you should be skeptical. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
But I would
Well,
argue then simultaneously as a Christian, from our
Right.
side of the house, you should also be skeptical.
So you don't believe because of reason or strength, but the scriptures do actually even encourage you to put it up to rigorous examination.
Right. Right.
Historical, legal. I mean, there's different ways to do it, right?
Well,
And that's under apologetics, I suppose. But
And at the very least, what I think Hitchens, he alludes to maybe, and I would argue this from, again, especially a Hebraic perspective, is Israel they don't have an abstract general knowledge of God. They don't have an abstract generalized belief in God. It's not quote unquote spiritualized. Their God is right there. Yahweh is in their midst in the tent. I brought this up yesterday in regards to worship.
yeah, he actually
There's no
talks to
other-
them personally.
He actually talks to them personally. Like, you don't have to climb mountains. You don't have to go on a trek. You don't have to go on some sort of inward spiritual pilgrimage and open up the doors of perception. You just go to the tent. He's right in the middle of the camp. And you see, again, how Platonism and Neoplatonism in particular has infiltrated the church in such a way over the millennia, so that we abstract everything, even Jesus. He's not even there's no bodily incarnation of God, because
Yeah.
Jesus is this abstract entity.
The
Almost-
Jesus seminar, right? Where we
Right.
can't even decide which words are authentic or not.
Exactly. That would be skepticism without any kind of, faith or trust in God's word being authentic or valid.
Well, let's talk about Jesus then in specific New Testament, because Jesus comes and appears to them and talks to them, and then they're like, "Well, that can't be," and you're like, "Why can't that be? That's what God's been doing God's been sending the Father's been sending His Son to talk to you before, and even in human form.
Right.
How are you surprised that now He actually takes on human flesh? Because that's
Right.
been part of the story the whole way,
the whole time.
the whole
Walking in
time.
the garden, talking to Abraham under the tree and eating.
And I
with
think,
Abraham.
I think ultimately what it is, angel of the Lord stuff, right? Is that when He comes in the flesh, it's like, well, we didn't mind it before because it was still a little general, right?
Yeah,
It's
come
a
and go,
cloud
come
one
and go.
time, and
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
burning bush this
Yeah.
time, whatever.
Yeah.
But now it's like, no, this is actually a person that we can hear, like He sleeps, you can touch Him, He eats
Right.
with us. It's a little too intimate,
Right.
right? He's a little too close.
Too definite.
what-
I always talk about. It's too definite.
Oh, He's not like a shadowy figure. Well, that's the resurrection appearance, right?
Too
I'm not a
specific.
ghost. What do you...
Right.
Can a ghost do this and he eats the fish,
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's when it gets too much.
Right.
Well, really, it's the scandal of the incarnation.
Right.
It's like,
Which is why we tend to stay with God as a kind of proper noun rather than Jesus.
big man in the sky, as they say.
Yeah, exactly. And then, to essentially use John 1 as that hermeneutical key that we talk about, this is the Word of God, which opens up the scriptures to us to understand that it's all about the Word of God because it's all the Word of God. And that's, again, the metaphysical conversation that takes place. But yet in the history of Israel, it takes place simultaneous to the fact that He's right there.
Yeah. So it's a
it's not
scandal
one or the
both to
other.
Israel and also to the Greek, to
Right.
Greek philosophy ultimately.
Yeah.
It's like, no, the body is, God has chosen
Right.
to take on human flesh and
Right.
not deal with it.
Right. Which is why John talks about the Logos taking on human flesh.
Right. Exactly.
Which is offensive to, like you said, it's offensive to Jews because why would God take on human flesh like that?
and why would you say God's word is the logos?
And why
the
would
Greek
you say
logos?
the Logos takes on? Exactly.
It's like, wait a minute, you can't co-opt that language. That's scandalous too.
And so at a certain point then, actually it's kind of led us to an interesting intersection, is at a certain point then theology and philosophy have to part company on the matter of Logos.
I think
Because
so.
we're talking about two different things.
Well, I mean, you say how is it, what is comparable, and then what is new or what is undermined.
Right.
You take that term and you undermine it sometimes
New
too.
data has come to light in regards to the Logos.
Well, even things like the equinox festivals and the way the Christians co-opt that. The Easter. The fertility. Like, you were worshiping like your own body's fertility or
Right.
the earth's fertility, but actually it's about the resurrection.
Right.
What?
Right.
You mean spring's about the resurrection? Yeah, spring's a picture of the resurrection.
It's like Lebowski. New information has come to light, man.
Yeah. Really like that rug.
Really. So I think I have found a way. I am a non-scientist who has profited a lot from the studying of this discussion, of putting it to a lay audience in such a way as can be clearly understood. If you like, I'll share it with you. Do you want me to share? Sharing is such a lovely word, isn't it?
It's hilarious.
Well, it's this. I have taken the best evidence that I can, most recently the night before last in Georgetown, from Francis Collin, who, as you know, completed the Human Genome Project, but who believes himself to be the object of divine design. Quote, I was very impressed once when hiking to find a frozen waterfall that went into 3. By the way, this sentence, I've never talked to, it's never come up, but this sentence was a part of my reading of Hawking's Brief History of Time, which is what pushed me to start contemplating the existence of God.
And it was Francis Collins, the head of NIH.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it was one of these quotes.
He's still around. He's Fauci's boss.
I was very impressed once when hiking to find a frozen waterfall that went into 3 parts, a trinity. I knelt down that very moment and gave himself, he says, to Jesus. Though I don't see what Jesus has to do with freezing the waterfalls. Well, what it has to do, my friend, is that as a physicist, as a physicist, what he's recognizing is that that's not supposed to freeze.
A waterfall?
Because it's moving.
Uh-huh.
And it froze. And that doesn't fall within the parameters of how he had been taught to think about the physical world and universe.
Okay.
And it caused him to take a step back and go, why is the water frozen if it's moving? And
well, if it's in 3 parts, then it must be.
And if it's in 3 parts, and he starts going down this rabbit hole. And again, he's being a scientist. He's running through the methodology. He's running through the rationale for what he's thinking through and his presuppositions. And he says, this is so elegant. This is so elegant that this couldn't possibly have happened by accident.
All right. So do we need to talk about that before we keep going? About intelligent design? The theory of intelligent design? I don't know. I mean,
I don't support it myself, so you can go with it if you want.
Well, I understand.
Ard Lewis out of Oxford does a really good job of explaining it. If you want to go check out Ard, A-R-D Lewis, he's on YouTube. He's a lot of interviews with Eric Metaxas, I think.
No, so I don't think it's beneficial towards faith, but it's beneficial for faith.
Sure.
Right. So you look at it and you say,
maybe.
Well, no, I mean, I think it's just more for Christians. You look at things and you're like, wow, it's amazing. It's in order. It's been put in places, and then you say, well, but there's entropy. Oh, it's falling into chaos and disorder. Well, why is that? But I mean, these things we can explain from a Christian perspective, I think, quite well.
Sure.
But when you're outside of the faith, I don't ever know. I wasn't there. You look at I don't know. We've talked about Fibonacci sequence before, and it's just like, isn't that amazing that there's this pattern that shows up in all sorts of aspects of the world? Right. How is that possible? That there would be that repeated pattern.
Maybe unless there's just because we are pattern recognition people, and we're just constantly seeking to find the relationships between things.
Well, why are we patterns people? Because he mentioned that before, and I thought of Carl Jung, of course, with archetypes and that sort of thing.
That we have to find how these things are similar because it basically crafts a sense of understanding and meaning for us about what's happening.
No, he's not suggesting that we impose that that it's actually there. Yeah. The patterns are there.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I'm just thinking this through. I'm thinking out loud. I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm just like thinking it through what others have said. Like Carl Jung we're trying to make sense of the chaos because if we don't, we'll basically go insane or become fatalist because we recognize we're out of control. And we're kind of like a bobber in the ocean in the middle of a tsunami. And so we have to find these patterns because like with QAnon and with other conspiracies, we have to find the patterns because the patterns give meaning to things that are seemingly without reason or rhyme. And
or they're just so incredibly
connect things.
They're so incredibly complex that we can't understand them without a simple paradigm. Okay.
Back in the day in college, it was explained to me this way that, and this is actually built off of Aristotle and his definition of luck, which is, like my professor said, it's like we're out hunting, and Steve over here, he's one of my hunting parties. Steve just got gored by a woolly mammoth, and I didn't. And so I get home at the end of the day, I'm like, well, Steve was a great hunter. He was better than I was, and he didn't do anything wrong, but he got gored by the mammoth and I didn't. Why did that happen? And then you start thinking it through. Or why is Gillespie the king of this country and I'm a pig farmer? Like, how did that happen?
Fate.
And I ended up fate, destiny, the gods, luck.
Well, and
karma.
those were all in person. Those all had personal,
Right.
people. I mean, there was Lady Luck, I suppose, Fortuna, right? I mean, she's
Fortuna,
the god of fortune.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well,
And
so
I
that's
think on
a
that
way
side
of explaining what can't be
Right.
explained.
Exactly. That you're
Okay.
trying to explain things because you got hit, he got hit with a spear and you didn't. He got gored and you didn't. He died from terminal cancer and you didn't. He got the raise and you didn't. He's king and you're not. So how did this happen? And so we're constantly looking for patterns. Alan Watts I just listened to a lecture by Alan Watts this morning on money and talking about like money's not real. It's an abstraction, but we create all these abstractions like inches, minutes, dollars, and all of these things are how we try to measure reality.
Bitcoin's real, though, by the way.
There we go. Bitcoin's real. You still have to explain to me the whole like how Bitcoin is like polluting the earth kind of thing that Musk was going on about.
No, that was just market manipulation.
I was going to say, like, how does digital currency affect the...
But when China shuts down all of the mining farms in the Sichuan province,
There we go.
that does affect Bitcoin.
I was going to say that makes sense to me talking about...
That was
recognition.
a 16% drop almost immediately
Yeah.
when you
That's
lose
crazy.
all those. I think they
Right.
were in the network anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
So I've read Hitchens before. I read Hitchens. I didn't really read Hitchens when I was an atheist because I didn't discover him until later. And he really
Me
wasn't on
neither.
the scene in the mid 90s. For me, I wasn't aware of him. And like I said, I was more like a Hawking and
No, I don't think
the
he popped
physics
until the
and-
new atheist thing took off.
yeah, yeah,
You know.
yeah.
One other thing, though, I mean, Jesus deals with this too,
Mm-hmm.
with the Tower of Siloam, right?
Yeah.
And there, he deals with the way that people are like, well, whose fault was it? Was it something they did? Was it something their parents did? Where can we put? We can't explain why the tower fell, but we need a reason. They're going to tell us,
Right.
and he's like, okay, I'll give you the reason. It's what was it? Do you remember?
That God might be glorified.
Yeah, you're like,
Something like that.
it's like what? How,
Yeah.
what? It's for this moment that you would ask, and then you would believe in me. You're like, wait a minute. So you killed those? They let the tower fall, and so in fact, you killed those people just so that I would believe.
Mm-hmm.
That's not helpful, Jesus. I'm sorry.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Or the massacre, right? Because that was the second example. There's the massacre, and I'm like, well, why did you do that? Same reason.
Yeah.
Like, wait, that's not. That seems about as capricious as Lady Fortune, right?
Right. Well, the
Like,
upside,
yeah.
the logic is upside down and backwards.
Mm.
Because the
do
answer
you-
he gives isn't the answer that we are seeking, and therefore we deem that to be that is an unacceptable answer. Because he's Jesus, and if he's God, then he must give us an answer that satisfies our curiosity, our yearning, our fear, and that's not hope. That's not helpful.
Oh, here's what he says. He says, do you think that all those were worse offenders than the others who lived in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, but unless you repent, you will likewise perish. Right?
There we go. Mhm.
So, I mean, they were outside of repentance, and look at that and say, maybe
Right.
maybe I should take things seriously. I don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. Speaking of not knowing the future, that tower
almost
might
like-
fall on me.
It almost falls parallel to Lazarus and the rich man.
Yeah, like you didn't know better. Yeah, you knew better.
Yeah.
You had Moses and the prophets.
Right. Right. Why
No.
are you asking me questions you know the answers to?
You already knew. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, why do bad things happen to good people? Right? And it's like, no, that's the wrong question anyway.
Wrong question because it's the wrong anthropology.
And that was a book written by a Jewish rabbi, by the way.
Right.
So there you go.
Why do bad things happen to people that worked in Tower 7?
Ooh, mean the controlled demolition?
The three towers. It's the three towers, not the twin towers, people. Ask yourself. Why don't they want us to remember the third tower?
I mean, tinfoil hat. Alex Jones was right.
I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there because it came up in my brain pan. Just having fun this morning, people. Just having fun. So I had to think. I found a way. He's a non-scientist. So he's like, listen, as a non-scientist, I'm looking through this. I'm reading about Francis Collins, completed the Human Genome Project. Appreciate the guy for doing it, And yet, unfortunately, the dude's a Christian because of it. And I'm not cool with that.
What kind of Christian, though? Right? I mean,
Well, there is that question, sure. But he's like, Collins relates how he knelt down and gave himself to Jesus. And
that's why I said that. Yeah.
yeah, and Hitchens is like, I don't get what Jesus has to do with freezing waterfalls. Don't go chasing waterfalls.
Now, if it were shaped in the form of a cross and it spoke and said,
Right. Nebuchadnezzar with a finger on the wall kind of thing.
yeah, go create GenBank and
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, he continues then. It could have been Muhammad. This is Hitchens saying this. It could have been Muhammad. It could have been Krishna. But he chose the Nazarene, which I appreciate Hitchens using that term because that's the term I use in my book.
The Nazarene.
Yeah, because of course, wither tongue.
He's emphasizing the humanity of Jesus there.
Exactly.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I wrote, total aside, sorry folks, the book's come out next year, but the whole reason I wrote the book is just a vent, basically. Get rid of all my demons. But yeah, that's what I realized. And I'm like, I'm writing this. I hope at least one person appreciates the fact that what Wither Tongue is doing by referring to him as the Nazarene all the time is, thank you for recognizing exactly that point. He's just a man. He's just a man.
A spiritual man, but a man.
But just a man. Yeah, we're not going to acknowledge he's deity. So who therefore demonstrates that for many people it is possible to hold apparently irreconcilable ideas in the head at the same time. And who was the man I was very proud to have met and wanted to have even discussed it with, which is awesome. Again, Hitchens is just like, listen, I think the guy is living in like cognitive dissonance, but I really want to talk to him about it because Human Genome Project,
That's a brilliant guy. Yeah, that's a brilliant guy.
Yeah. And Slavoj-Žižek had a debate with somebody about this. Maybe was it Jordan P? Where he and Jordan P talked about belief and morality and stuff like that. It might be on YouTube. Again, I think it's one of those other long meandering conversations between two extremely knowledgeable and articulate people who are on opposite ends of the philosophical spectrum, so to speak.
And well, at least with Peterson, searching, right?
Yeah, right.
For understanding.
Yeah, Žižek, and I don't know, maybe he's changed. I haven't read Žižek since college, but he used to impress me as a rather hedonistic sort of guy. And he seems like the kind of professor that would smoke pot with you at the party because he was hitting on the co-eds. Mm-hmm. That's the way Žižek always impressed me. Whereas Jordan P is the professor you go to when your life is falling apart and you're getting an F.
How do you spell Žižek?
Zizek. Slavoj. Slavoj.
Let's see. Slavoj Žižek debates Jordan Peterson. Clean audio. All right, here, I'll link it up.
There we go.
There's actually a whole Wikipedia article on the topic, originally titled Happiness, Capitalism, and Marxism.
Okay, there we go.
All right, so copy the link address. There we go.
So very well, I asked him,
There you go.
how long, doctor, do you believe the human species, Homo sapiens, after our brief encounters with the Cro-Magnon and the Neanderthals and so on, have been autonomous as Homo sapiens on the earth? I've heard from Carl Sagan and Richard Dawkins, maybe it's as long as 200,000, maybe 240,000, or 250,000 years, or as low as, ? And he said as low as 100,000 could only be 100,000. I said, okay, I'm Jewish on my mother's side. I'll take 100,000 years then. That's all I need for this experiment. 100,000 years, ladies and gentlemen, of our species born, probably dying a lot, evidently dying a lot in childbirth by killing its mother while doing so, but managing to get born. Living, life expectancy for the first 15,000 years, probably not more than about 20 to 25. By the way, this is entirely speculative on his part.
Yeah, we don't actually know this.
No, we don't. And it can't be subjected to the scientific methodology, and therefore it's purely speculative.
Even going back, say, 500 years, you still, the data isn't complete. It's
correct.
It's still speculative.
And I bring it up just in the sense of he's speculating, and he realizes that. That's why he's, kind of bantering about with it. But again, to not fall into kind of scientific dogmatism or scientism, recognize that if it can't be scrutinized by way of the scientific method, it's speculative. It's an educated guess at best.
Yeah, they'll take a small sample size. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of somebody, like Johann Sebastian Bach, right? He had 2 wives, 20 kids, and I think, half of them made it to adulthood. Mm-hmm. And so you look at that, you have a few examples, I don't know, maybe a lot of examples of that, famous people, especially writing in their diaries or whatnot, where they, and then you're like, and then you extend it out, you project it out, and you say, well, then that must be true everywhere, even though Bach is living in a city and has access, or maybe you project, you stretch it out and you say, well, he had better access to medicine than others, and so he probably, 50% is.
If you look at firsthand accounts from places like China, people are extremely, and India of all places, where you're like, well, India, I mean,
third world kind of thing, yeah.
Really third world, fourth world, fifth world, caste system. you'd think, yeah, people's lives would be much shorter in those tropical areas or in China. No, extremely long-lived.
Yeah. Right. So, and then that was my point. It's like, well, wait a minute. Bach was living in some of the earliest, modern city. So talk about toxins, talk about, environmental effects. How do we know that that was not negative towards him and that those who were living in the rural areas weren't doing better?
Correct.
Whose data isn't recorded,
Right.
So, yeah.
Yes. So, living, dying, 15,000 years, so forth, so on. Dying of microorganisms we did not know were there. Dying of our teeth, which were suspiciously too near our brain when they rotted or became infected.
That's true, actually.
Terrified by earthquakes, lightning, floods, famines, inexplicable cataclysmic events. Fighting one another for sex, for food, for shelter, for territory, all of that.
Anything new here?
Yeah, I was going to say, when are you going to get to the stuff that's changed? Any of you can fill in this bit for yourself as trope. Have a rough picture of what it was like. Slow and gradual and much backsliding. But a sort of upward progression. There's the word.
I knew it was coming.
That's very Aristotelian or Platonic, depending on which worldview you're taking. But it's very Aristotelian in the sense of like we're climbing this staircase of progress.
Right, and like I said before, it may be a philosophy, but it's a religious philosophy.
Right.
Or it's religiously adhered to, right?
Right. It is, because, again, fear, love, and trust. So, upward progression to where we are approximately now. Think of the wars now. Think of the famines, the rapes, the gods they had. Think of the bears they worshipped and made their skulls into totems. Think of the waterfalls they thought magic. You mean like magic liquid in a syringe that's injected under your skin? Think of the
nanoparticles. Lipid nanoparticles.
Yeah. Think of the rocks they thought were special. You mean like people who rub their crystals?
Right. Or what is it? I wanted to get one of the lamps. It's like the new lava lamp. It's the Himalayan salt lamps.
Yes. I love those. Because then every morning I can wake up and lick it.
Like a cow.
It gives light and I can lick it.
Need a little bit more salt in my diet.
I think what you also see then is in what he's describing is if we push back against this from the other side and just like, let's just use logic. Let's just use our own historical, speculative, our own lay knowledge of science that we've gathered over the last 20 or 30 years of our own personal study and research.
Right.
This is an increasingly smaller and smaller group of people that he's appealing to. Because if I say there's people that carry around crystals and rub essential oils on their feet, well, they're out now because he would simply dismiss them as being kooks, right? They're thoughtless people. They're uneducated. They're superstitious. They're out. Get rid of them. Flat Earthers out. Aliens out. Bigfoot out. Anti-vaxxers out. And again, it just gets narrower and narrower, and the tent gets smaller and smaller until it's just you and everybody else who agrees with you in that nodding heads club. And at that point, I have to ask, I'm not saying that any of those other things that you dismissed aren't quote unquote scientific. They're not. Except the anti-vaxxer part, which we could argue about. But
I think you're wrong on the oils, but anyway, keep going.
No, I'm saying all oils, not just the ones that actually work, like oregano oil, for example.
Frankincense is beautiful. It's beautiful.
It's true. But the point of, okay, we're going to dismiss all those people because we're going to construct this dogmatic position that you have to be inside the tent to be with us. Yeah. Anyone who falls outside the tent can't be with us because they're not like us. And hey, Bill, welcome to the show. Arizona, nice.
Carefree.
So welcome. Yeah.
Is Arizona carefree? Oh yeah, maybe. You probably care for water though. Isn't there a water problem in Arizona?
Bill, is there a water problem in Arizona?
There's a water problem in Arizona.
Is California siphoning off all your water?
Yeah, probably. Did they have water in the first place? I thought it was. Oh, it's high desert, right? Mostly.
Terraform, baby.
Just go to Mars. Or no, let's go to the moon first. Then Venus.
We can't go to the moon because that's where they're actually building, which is why they're constantly talking to us about Mars to distract us from.
Right, but Venus actually has water.
Yeah.
And that hexagon cloud, which I really think we got to figure that one out. I need to know what that's all about.
Well,
it's a pattern thing. It's a pattern thing. Why is there a hexagon on the pole?
I thought you were talking about how the funding for NASA goes down, so then they invent something new that they need money to go and look at and investigate.
Well, there's that too.
It's like the whole space station traveling at 5,000 miles an hour. I sent you that video, and then they showed a jet moving at the speed of sound, and then speeding up the film to 8 to 10 times the speed of sound, and that's a fraction of the speed that the space station, the EAST, is moving. And so the question becomes then, well, how can you go outside of the space station and not have it just leave you behind? Like, again, jumping out of a car while it's still moving.
Do you want me to explain the physics of this? Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
It's not really relevant to...
No, it's Monday morning and we're having fun.
No, so I'm thinking about all this stuff. He's talking about explaining the unexplainable, right? And then how religion has kind of taken the place to all these inexplicable cataclysmic events.
Right.
And but he's categorically dismissing it and saying not that the things don't happen, but that the religious explanation has no value. Like, I don't know if that's necessarily true.
Right.
Because I mean, if you worship the bear and so you avoid the bear, it's probably going to go well for you to avoid the bear.
True.
You know? So you say, well, it has no value. Well, it has a value. Maybe it doesn't have scientific value. It doesn't help you understand bears better.
But do you need to understand them better other than, hey, we were out in the woods the other day and Joe got eaten by a grizzly bear. Therefore.
Well, I was going to give you an analogy from my former vocation before I went to seminary, which I was in retail sales and selling audio video equipment. And they love the expression snake oil to talk about all the things that can't be measured, right? That's the naysayers. The naysayers come along and say, well, it doesn't show up in the measurements, so it doesn't exist, right? Or we can't demonstrate it in a double blind, whatever test, or it doesn't pass a null test. You don't have to understand what any of this is. But they say because we can't scientifically prove it, then it doesn't actually happen. And then what I would do is I'd sit people down in front of, two different, pair of speakers. All the electronics are the same because I was a scientist, right? So it was like, we're going to keep all the variables the same. We're going to use all the same gear, same players, same cables, the whole deal, all the way through, because all those things might be a variable. And all we're going to do is change the speaker. And we can't do it A/B. We can't switch back and forth. But so you're going to have to take it in, and then we'll play the same thing on the other one, and then we'll go back, and you can jump back and forth as many times as you do. And they're like, and they measure almost the same, if not exactly the same. Right. And people said, well, they sound like two different CD players. Like, CD players, what? Same price point, and they sound different. You're like, but they measure the same. I'm like, well, how is that? Well, it's because your perception is more than just data from scientifically evaluated data. Right. There's an emotional component that's not really measurable. It's like they make you feel different. You're like, how do they make you feel different? God, if I know.
Yeah.
I mean, I do this now with recording stuff. I have different microphones. They measure identically or nearly identically, and yet they sound quite different. And you're like, what? How is that possible? Like, there's things that we can't measure,
right?
But that we can perceive,
right?
Nietzsche
maybe that's after this. No, Nietzsche
maybe
goes
that's
after this.
Yeah. That's the
same
thing.
Point is
like
his point is that the appeal to reason, again going back to his critique of Socrates and Plato, and then through Descartes, his critique of Western civilization and Western society is its over reliance on reason, and that his argument is we're not reasonable.
Reason itself is limited.
And reason itself is limited to the individual and to the group, and that we don't behave reasonably, but we constantly appeal to logic and reason. We appeal to logic because we believe we're reasonable people, and essentially then this Western philosophical tradition that is, no, we're reasonable. That's what defines us as people. That's what our consciousness is. It's all about reasoning and being logical. And he's like, that's just a grand lie.
So
we're not.
Scientific method, reason, acquisition of knowledge. Hitchens is approaching those as dogmatic categories that are unchangeable.
Correct.
Or don't change.
Right.
And like, well, what was reasonable, 500 years ago would be different today.
Correct.
Because our reason has changed. I mean, even philosophy has changed. Well, not just philosophy, but even logic.
Right.
I mean, there's new fallacies, right? We call them fallacies today, but if you ask, Aristotle, he'd be like, what's that?
Yeah. Well,
maybe you could
authority is a logical fallacy.
Right, but I think Aristotle identified that one.
He did, but I was like, we've spent the last year and a half, 16 months appealing
we
to
forgot
authority.
it. Well, and there's that aspect too.
It.
Maybe we never learned it, or if we did know it, we've now forgotten. I mean, we've talked about this before, but I know I was taught don't believe everything you read in the papers.
That too.
Which is another. I mean, looking at the media as being an authority, and I'm like, no, they don't. They have no authority.
Right.
They have no authority. Except for what you give them.
Correct.
And if they can't demonstrate their truthfulness, and if they're inconsistent on their truthfulness, then their authority is going to wane or going to fall apart. Right. It's like, why is anybody watching? I don't know. Pick your major news network today. Why are they watching them? It doesn't matter. Even all the conservative ones, Fox or whatever.
Right.
Why do you? I mean, I remember like actually appreciating NPR, for example. Not because I thought they were particularly objective, mostly just because they were boring. So it sounded objective.
Not government funded.
Well, that is the problem. Yeah, and you can't bite the hand that feeds you.
Right.
So
we'll just play with the words, and then you won't recognize what's really happening.
Well, and I think we've quoted the Bible on this one. All men are liars.
Correct.
So we just I think, that's that skeptic position, is to say, let's just assume that you're not telling the whole truth, or, you have your own agenda. And let's try to figure out what the agenda is, and maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. And maybe it's truthful, maybe it's not. But
we were talking about this before we hit record, is the Jocko podcast, where he talks about the distinction between leaders and prophets.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And you can't really be a leader and a prophet simultaneously. They're
no, because leadership is coercive. Is that a fair way to say it?
In a positive sense of there's the truth, and if I just come straight out and tell you the truth, it may actually hurt morale. It may uninspire you. It may cause you to quit and resign. And there's all these things that can happen if I just tell you the straight truth. You don't accept it as the truth because you feel like you're being attacked. So as a leader, you have to be tactful about how you speak the truth to people, or how you withhold the truth for the sake of the team or the sake of the mission. And that there's a time and a place to be like straight line, honest, this is the truth. And then there's other times as a leader where you have to pick and choose.
I mean, it is subversive and manipulative, and we can use those negative terms, but I guess the difference is intent. For the aim of preserving the life of those that are under your command. For example, this is 285. I linked to it below.
Right. Whereas the prophet is just straight line. Here's the truth.
Well, and that's our preferred methodology. I think. Just undistill it.
Right. Well, I was watching this documentary that tracks the infiltration of the Communist Party into Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, and how many people around Dr. King were communists, and how Dr. King himself attended a communist school seminar, and Rosa Parks was a part of that as well. And you go down this rabbit trail, and even within the Nation of Islam and Brother Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad, and all this stuff, and they're where he was getting his money from, and you follow it, and you're like, okay. A lot of people venerate Dr. King, and he made some great speeches, and he was probably assassinated by his own people and the FBI, as was Malcolm X. And yet to say to then a person, let's say we're talking about fighting CRT right now and pushing back against critical race theory because it's Marxist and communist and a lie, and we use Dr. King to do that, or we use Malcolm X to do that. Is it helpful then in the midst of that conversation to bring up the communist infiltration of the civil rights movement and how the civil rights movement was manipulated by communists for its own ends?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Nope.
It's not very kind or charitable to the people in that moment, because they're having a conversation about, like, we're going to use Dr. King's legacy, we're going to use Malcolm X's legacy, the civil rights movement's legacy, to combat this racist theory. And so to bring this up at the same time, when we're trying to combat communism and Marxism, it's probably not helpful to say, well, we're using kind of like this platform that was infiltrated by communism and Marxism over here to fight against communism and Marxism over here on this side. It's just going to lead to confusion and might disenfranchise people, and people are probably going to turn on you because it's Dr. King. And so in that sense, to be a leader then within that conversation, within that group, is to be like, tactfully, you just don't talk about that stuff because it's not germane to the conversation at the moment.
I think we had that a little bit with Black Lives Matter as well, because of course Black Lives Matter. So the name was almost a distraction from the intent that was behind it. Right. At least I think not even with general lay people. A lot of people who promoted it or did the black bloc on their social media or something. Right. But the leadership clearly had other aims in mind. Right. But it made it hard to talk about because you're like,
because it's an appeal to emotion.
It is. Yeah, very much so. Right. Which is a kind of flanking maneuver, I suppose. Right. It's not a direct maneuver.
Right. So 98,000 years has gone by. So now may be time to intervene. And the best place to do it, the best place to conduct this intervention would not be China. where people can read and make gunpowder, but in Bronze Age Palestine. That would be a good place to implant the idea by a human sacrifice. Of course, we always do that. And then see if the news can spread in pure form by word of mouth.
Wow.
Yeah, Josh McDowell covered this in More Than a Carpenter back in the 70s.
That they were simpletons and that's why they got it?
No, that Josh McDowell's argument is like, so you're telling me that these 12 guys perpetrated this lie under threat of execution. Like their guy just got executed. And somehow they managed to convince the guards to get the stone out of the way, which, by the way, would require all of them to do. No one would find out about it. No one would know because no one's going to tell under the worst. Like Peter was tortured. We know that.
Right.
Like these guys were, John was tortured. We know all these guys were tortured before they were executed. And not one of them's going to crack. Not the centurions that got paid off, that got bribed to open the tomb up so they could steal the body. Not one of them is going to like crack under interrogation. And then all these other people are going to become a part of this movement that they know is going to lead them to be excommunicated from their community by the Jewish authorities and possibly executed by Roman authority.
Right.
Like, and then it spread amongst the poorest of the poor for like a century before like anybody else picked it up and ran with it.
Well, and this was my point. I think he's being naive because apply the scientific method then, like you're doing just now, to these, what we would say are historic events. And try to explain them away, and you find that it's hard to do, right?
Right. Just do a forensic audit.
Yeah, exactly.
Go through the text. There's extra biblical texts that testify to the same things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Roman and Jewish authority.
Roman and Jewish, both saying like, hey, we got these people called the Way, and they're all about this carpenter, this Nazarene, this Galilean. And they say these things about him, and even under, again, they talk about it, even under interrogation and torture, even when they're threatened with death and like horrible, like being thrown to the dogs and being like sent down into the mines and all these terrible things, they refuse to recant.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be insane to die for a lie.
That's kind of McDowell's argument. Mm-hmm. It's either the greatest, McDowell's argument is either Christianity is the greatest lie ever perpetrated, or this, but that's his point. Is like, if Jesus is a good moral teacher, there's lots of good moral teachers. And he wasn't actually a good moral teacher when you break it down. Maybe he was a spiritual guru. Well, you break it down again, that doesn't fit either. He's not, because he's a crazy man, right? He's insane.
Right.
But if he's insane, that doesn't fit either, then how come all these other people are following him? And then after the fact. And even when you try and divide Jesus and Paul and the religion of Jesus and Paul, like Schweitzer and others do at the end of the 19th century,
sure,
the logic doesn't fit at the end of the day. So you either, McDowell's point is either you just have to throw the entire Bible out as being the rantings of just multiple lunatics, or you have to accept that there's veracity to the claims of the disciples following the resurrection of Jesus, and this is why.
Well, and I think, like I've talked about this, it was probably in the last episode, probably the first half. Mm-hmm. You go look at the debate with Hitchens and the guy from Moscow, Idaho, the Collision movie. You have to watch it on their, I don't think it's publicly available anymore in print, but you can watch it streaming on the Canon Press app or website. Mm-hmm. Canon Press is what it is. I'll have to try to find a link to it. But when he's debating like an actual well-trained Christian apologist, Hitchens, that he's not as simple as here, and I think he can get away with it here. I think that's what's happening.
Right.
His audience isn't going to challenge him on this.
Correct.
Being overly simplistic about it's not just Palestine. I mean, these Palestine. There's plenty of data that you have to actually work through and reconcile to make this kind of assertion.
Right. So I don't know about you, he says. I've debated a lot of religious people now. I know it's conceivable that in nature there's such a thing as parthenogenesis. That is, a virgin could conceivably conceive without the rather exquisite preconditions that are thought by some to be so problematic. Why so many gods have been born that way, I don't quite know. I don't think of the birth canal as a one-way street, and I hope neither do you. And since resurrection is so commonplace in the New Testament, happens all the time, if it was commonplace then, it doesn't seem commonplace now. It would mean it was not particularly special that there was a resurrection there either. Certainly would not prove the doctrines of the person who was so resurrected. But I can't be brought to believe the story I've just told you, which must be true if religion is true. If religion is true, that's what happened to our species. And that is impossible, and it is irreconcilable with what we know. It is incompatible with what we know. It cannot be squared with any concept we can possibly form of scientific knowledge or of the development of our cosmos, biosphere, or species. So we'd be better off without it, even if it preached morality, which it does not. And to Hitchens' point, to quote Tertullian, I believe because it's absurd. I've said that numerous times. The reason I am a Christian and became a Christian, and why I'm a Lutheran by conviction, is because upon further study of all the holy texts that I went through in my 20s to try and figure out what the hell was happening to me, the only one that stuck out as specifically unique was the New Testament. Specifically, like I say, the writings in 1 John, and then going back to the Gospel of John and going, this is like no other holy book I've ever read.
Right.
And, I've read Mircea Eliade at length. I've got his comparative religions book out in my library here. And he's right. Hitchens is right. There is similar creation stories, similar end time stories, similar savior stories, similar virgin birth stories, sacrificial stories, all this stuff. They're very similar. But they're similar. They're not the same. And I also have to ask the question then, how is it that a South Pacific Islander and someone in Iceland can come up with almost the same creation story and the same end time story and the same savior story? And so I get his point, but also take a step back and ask, how can two groups of people completely unconnected come up with the same stories? How come the Chinese character for, which one is it, for boat, or is a flood?
Noah. Yeah, it's for Noah.
Yeah.
It's a boat. It's water. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's for his name. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like these things are happening all over. And the comparative religious people just said, well, this just proves it's a trope. Like, to his point, it's just a trope. Versus people of different faiths are arguing, no. Like, we would argue that, no, you're all riffing. It's like we talk about the Abrahamic story of Isaac's sacrifice was misheard and misinterpreted to mean, if I want God to give me something, I got to sacrifice my firstborn child. And that's how human sacrifice basically takes off.
So Moloch is really just a distortion of Abraham.
Yeah. And that if you track it back to its source, then to Quella, what you get then is every culture is taking this proclamation, this witness, this testimony, and not interpreting it correctly and spinning it out, like we said, into a religion and saying, no, I heard this guy, this wandering Aramean, told this story about how he took his son up on a mountain and killed him. And then God gave him a ram. And you're like, okay, not quite.
Well, and this was my other point, is that, or the point that I think you're making actually, is that of all the so-called religions, I mean, we don't want to paint with such a broad brush to recognize that there are distinctions between them.
Correct.
They do have a lot of things in common, many of them. Some of them are quite different. Think of Hinduism, for example.
Right.
But also, Christianity is the only one that actually wants you to subject it to scientific scrutiny.
Right.
Right. Now, not everything can be proven scientifically. Actually, I don't think any of it can be proven scientifically, beyond a shadow of a doubt. Yeah. But it allows itself to be scrutinized that way.
Right.
Like Paul says, if Christ isn't raised from the dead, our faith is in vain.
Correct.
Which he's actually compelling you to say, find the bones, right? Prove it. Prove that he's still in the grave.
Right.
He was doing that to his audience, which it would have been easier for them to do. That was 1 Corinthians, right? So that's probably like 1 Corinthians, probably in the 40s, maybe, or early 50s at the latest, maybe. Maybe even 30s. I don't know. But I think most people agree it's the first epistle. It's the earliest epistle.
Right.
And he's compelling him to go do it. Go find it. Prove it.
Well, at
Prove
the
me
end
wrong.
of the day, we can debate and have fun all we want, but at a certain point, we have to acknowledge that our belief in the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, is entirely based on faith.
For
Because
us,
it's a historical
absolutely.
event. It's a historical event. And regardless of whether we want to argue the facts of the case historically or not, anything that you accept that is historical is a matter of faith. For example, Socrates actually was a person.
Bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Napoleon's White Horse, whatever you want to say. So that's one thing, is to say, no, faith in Christ, faith in the resurrection is the foundation of the Christian faith. That's why it's called the Christian faith. Second of all, morality, because he keeps bringing this back up. We have to define morality. We have to define, is morality objective or subjective? And then if it's objective, Why is it objectively true? How do we know that? What is that about? Like, where does that come from? If it's subjective, then your argument is moot, because that means that every religious group, every social group, every clan, every tribe, every nation just makes up morality as they go. So no religion is moral, no social group is moral. And this is Nietzsche's point in Beyond Good and Evil, is that it's if morality is a social construct and not objectively true, then nothing is moral, objectively speaking.
Right.
So that, like Bill Hicks argues, you know the difference between good drugs and bad drugs is that good drugs are taxed drugs and bad drugs are not taxed drugs. So if the government can't
authorized,
tax it,
okay,
exactly. So good drugs are government authorized drugs. Bad drugs are non-government taxed drugs. And if you go by that, then the entire morality that's been constructed around the quote unquote war on drugs is a farce. It's a construct. And therefore, if you subject the subjective morality of the drug war to an objective standard of morality, something's got to give. You either have to acknowledge, well, we made up the rules for what is a good drug and a bad drug, good and bad being moral categories, versus objective reality, which is, okay, well, this drug is actually medicinally used by people for thousands of years and actually seems to have actual medicinal benefits, and this doesn't.
Right.
And so, again, if you just follow Nietzsche's argument in Beyond Good and Evil as an example, and then follow the argument of the drug war, you step back and go, well, this doesn't make any sense, objectively speaking. So therefore, it's not moral. So then if you argue, well, Christianity isn't moral because of the argument from faith and it has no grounding in reality, part of that is true. But it's also the assumption, like we've talked about when we've read political theology, the assumption of God-given freedom is a bit of a leap, biblically speaking. But
you mean God-given in a secular sense?
In a secular sense, thank you. Sorry. God-given freedom in a secular sense is a bit of a leap, biblically speaking. But yet, it's the argument, our God-given freedoms. And the other side of the argument says, I don't actually believe in God. So therefore, I don't actually accept your argument for what freedom is.
Well, I mean, and if God is a spiritual reality, and then you're talking about him applying freedoms in a material, physical way, it ends up still being kind of anarchic, right? Because it's like, well, God's unknowable. And so this freedom you're talking about is really chaos. Right. I think that's the argument that's made. It's like you actually need overlords, because otherwise you're just going to fall into disorder and chaos, because that's what always happens. It's
Which
not
is
actually
Christian. Well, that's why you and I as Christians always warn people against confusing or conflating Christian freedom with secular freedom.
Right.
And just because we say a God-given freedom in a secular, civil, religious sense does not equate to Christian freedom in Christ.
Yeah.
Because God-given freedom, by the way, is usually, in my experience, people around me, God-given freedom is leave me alone to live my life. Christian freedom is send me to live for other people and serve them in my livelihood. One is freedom from responsibility and from others, and unless I choose to enter into it. And the other one is set free to be for the other.
Well, I thought of what I told my congregation this morning is to say, God sets us free to be left alone to love one another.
Correct.
I kind of conflated the two, right?
No, I like that. I like it. I think it's a good explanation.
Like we want, this was a Supreme Court ruling last week, which is, I think there's some positive and negatives to it, but it was a 9-0 decision to say, look, the Catholic foster care agency, if they don't want to place people in certain homes, that's their business, right? But because there are other agencies that will place children in homes that the Catholic agency thinks are inappropriate.
Yeah,
just leave them alone, because they're putting kids in foster care, right? They're fostering these kids. They're getting them taken care of. Like, just let it be. Why do you have to? And so, I mean, I think that's actually a pretty compelling argument for limited government from Supreme Court, which was surprising.
Yeah, I know. I was very shocked, actually.
Because it was partly religious freedom, but it was actually more limited government is really what was going on there. It's just, let those people alone. They're doing the work. They're not doing it in a way they're doing it according to the law.
Right.
And, so that's what we want. Christians ought not want the government to compel them to love one another, right?
Or
in the same way and really you don't want the church to do it either. That's what that was the argument I was making.
Right.
It's like, I don't go around prescribing people, here's how you need to love your neighbor over here.
Right.
because that's one, it's a limit to freedom, and then if it's a limit to freedom, it ends up just being more law and not actually a fruit of forgiveness.
I had the exact same conversation that I've been having for 13 straight years with somebody in Bible study yesterday about the matter of faith and love.
Yeah. Oh,
my elder came up to me afterwards in the vestry. He's like, just gave me that look. I'm like, I've had this exact same conversation every time we talk about faith and love with this same person for 13 years. And they refuse to acknowledge that love is not what defines Christians. Because his favorite hymn is, they will know we are Christians by our love.
I'm like, read Romans 3, by the way.
It's not a Christian hymn.
Not the second part where, we've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God, but the first part where it's talking about, the Jews not understanding, right?
Right.
Really, because, and the Gentiles either, they don't understand that, like, wait a minute, you're not going to actually define your faith by what you do. You're going to define it by what you receive. Doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, there you go.
So going on then, I listened to Kata Polit last night, as I always do when I get the chance. And I agree with her that we have some reason to be optimistic, at least on the territory of these United States, that our enemies are in retreat. That they are not only beaten in the courts, but they are humiliated in the courts. If you haven't read my friend Matthew Chapman's book on the Dover pen case, may I recommend it to you very strongly. Matthew is Charles Darwin's great-great-grandson.
Pedigree,
there we go. Argument, fallacy. He's a great friend of mine. He has recently decided to become re-involved in this matter. He's basically a filmmaker. He just thought he could not stay out of the argument any longer. He went to Dover, Pennsylvania. He sat there for the whole trial, which lasted 40 days and 40 nights. There we go. Which is the title of his book, which I recommend. And it just shows how small-town America could throw off this nonsense with some brio. There it is again, small-town America. He keeps just dismissing people. And that is very much to the good, I think. And there are other indications as well of a fight back. However, if we look at the international picture, I find the situation very worrying. Doesn't make me optimistic at all. In Russia recently, mobilized by the extremely cynical forces of Vladimir Putin's party and his security services, the Russian Orthodox Church, which we were just talking about before we hit record, is
ironic.
Back as a real part of the nationalist, autarkic, one-party, Russian chauvinist regime that he wishes to restore after the humiliations we visited on the great Russian idea the last few years. Well, I guess he was a little successful, wasn't he?
This is prophetic. If there,
right?
Well, he accomplished that.
Yeah.
There's a shirtless Putin riding on a horse.
That's right.
Or going for a bath with the priests on whatever day it was.
Yeah. At every point where that regime tries to impose itself, you will find a black draped figure standing next to the KGB man, and in the classroom too. It's coming. It could be very, very, very dangerous. It's very often ignored. When President Bush met Putin and saw he was wearing a crucifix, as you may remember, he said that was the obvious, clear proof that the man was a good egg. I just watched an interview with Hitchens last week where he brought that up again. A form of national suicide, it seems to me, that we have a president so easily taken in by a sadistic, expansionist goon who has a clerical militia as part of his campaign to intimidate Georgia, Poland, Chechnya, and the Baltic states, Ukraine, and beyond that, many others. It's going to be in our future, and theocracy is going to be one of the forms it's going to take. And it is nuclear. So think about that, if you would, for a bit.
Yeah, but we've been arguing repeatedly here of late that communism is the theocracy of China.
Right.
I don't think it's the religion of China as a whole. I mean, there's obviously Christians, Muslims, and others, but at least at the state level, that is their religiously held ideology.
Right.
Put it that way.
Yeah.
Right? And it has all sorts of superstitions and things attached to it, of course.
Yep. Exactly.
And so, but saying that there's a hand-in-glove KGB Russian thing, I think that's actually a little... maybe it doesn't play out quite like you thought it would. Because, how Russian Orthodox is Putin? It's really hard to know.
Yeah.
I don't know how much it affects his politics either.
Right. Well, it's like I said, he's a survivor, and he's always been the last man standing, and he says just enough to get people talking, get them stirred up, get them riled up. And every once in a while, he has someone injected with a poison on the streets of London who dies.
Well, here's the thing about Russia, I think, having been there, is that there is really only one institution that actually is in every community and village throughout the whole nation.
Exactly.
Which is quite large.
That's
and
correct.
not all that populous. So, and that's the Orthodox Church.
Correct.
So if you want the people, that's where you go. You know, and you don't alienate. I mean, even the Soviets, they didn't alienate the Orthodox Church. They alienated everybody else. They killed all the other Christians.
Right.
But they left the Orthodox for, well, not alone entirely, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
But Putin, I mean, Putin faced some significant challenges right away because he had a shrinking demographic.
Mm-hmm.
So he's like, well, who could we talk to about that? Oh yeah, the Orthodox. What did the Christians say about,
That's right.
about having children, like we talked about? Yeah, exactly. So hey, we can probably work that in. It's very interesting. I don't know. I don't know if I go with him here saying it's a theocracy. I think it's just a collaboration more than anything.
Yeah, hand in glove.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they help each other. It's kind of like China and the Vatican. You know.
Yeah, or China and Israel, or China and Great Britain, or China and Canada, or China and Ireland, or China and New Zealand. Yeah. Or China and the United States. Sorry.
Well, and
I almost left out the White House, sadly.
Like we've talked about before, if you try to, I think what we've learned from some of these regimes, if you destroy all of the religious ideology, if you try to kill all those people off or kill off something will take its place, and it will ultimately undermine you. It's much better to co-opt it.
Right. I was going to say, I read that book on Christianity and Bushido in Japan.
Japan, there you go. Yeah.
The feudal shogunate declares Christianity dead in Japan and wiped out. And then all of a sudden you find out about the hidden Christian churches. Because as my professor liked to say, the gospel thrives in crisis.
Right.
And the more you try to suppress the gospel of Jesus Christ, the more people are going to go hunting for it. You're going to actually create Christians by cracking down on it.
Mm-hmm. Or if not Christian, something. I mean, because people, they can't live in a purely atheistic, materialistic way.
Atheistic, materialistic, nihilistic.
Right, because it's nihilistic. That's right.
I was going to say, if you look at American society, that's exactly what's happening now, is that the consequences of nihilism have taken root.
Right, and I don't think but I don't think it's sustainable from generation to generation, because people will find it. Yeah, because they'll be like, well, what's the point of life then?
Exactly.
It's so self-destructive to the point of, I think people recognize, like, no, I need to have some purpose and meaning. I can.
Right. Right now that purpose and meaning is annihilating people that disagree with you. But did I send you that the society that was inspired by Greta Thunberg that then disbanded itself because it accused itself of racism?
We talked about it before the show, I think. I don't know if you sent it to me.
That's a real thing. Like these students inspired by Thunberg, they're like, we need to create a society. and then they disbanded the society because once they got together and looked around the room, they went, oh, well, this is racist.
And so we're the carbon that we need to eliminate. And
exactly.
Center.
Yeah. So no, it's not self-sustaining, because once you've eliminated and annihilated everyone who's not like you, you're left with yourself, and then you simply systemically annihilate yourself.
Right. Well, that's why I mean, like China's recognized this, or the Communist Party's recognized this, is like, the one-child policy, now the two-child, now the three-child.
Right.
We can't actually kill everybody off.
Right.
Because we actually depended upon them.
Right.
So we're going to have to find they lost their equilibrium, in other words.
Right.
Between murder and life.
Right. So now they're promoting birth while simultaneously diminishing birth in the West.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That's perfect.
Right. Well, because then they can take us over.
Well, I was going to say, because they got us to participate in it. It's fantastic. A little bit of psyops.
Here's some fentanyl if you like that too.
Exactly. So now Iran. Here's another case, again, 1999, folks. He's talking about Iran in 1999. Here's another case where religion doesn't always lead to moral results. In Iran, you are not allowed to execute a female virgin, whatever crime she has committed. She might have been a member of an opposition group. She might have blasphemed in some way. She might have uncovered her hair in public. Who knows what she might have done? But you are not allowed, even if the death penalty applies, to put her to death if she is a virgin. So she is raped by the Revolutionary Guards in prison, and then she can be executed.
There's always a way where there's a will.
Right. Well, this goes to our earlier point, though, that we just discussed a couple of minutes ago, is that if your morality is a social construct, it's not objectively true. You got to there's going to be a loophole. And that's the loophole. So how do you close the loophole? You do something that's totally immoral.
Or it is moral.
Well, actually, it is moral because Muhammad beheaded his rivals and then raped their wives on the carcasses.
Well, it's the highest sinful moral, right? Which is the means justifies the ends.
100%.
Yeah.
Just declare somebody an infidel, and then you're good to go.
Then you can rape them so that you can murder them. Okay.
Correct. And this, by the way, if you're not familiar with Hitchens, this is why the Western media was not always a big fan of him in interviews, because he was vehemently opposed to Islam, and especially Islam coming west.
Right. So he probably had the same kind of life expectancy as like Salman Rushdie did.
Yes. Well, you watch his interview with Charlie Rose, and Charlie tries to walk him back on this one. He's like, I ain't walking this back at all. I'm going to go. Actually, I'm going to double down now on what I said about Iran.
And I linked that in the last show. I'll link it again here.
Yeah. But he's just simply stating, listen, if I observe what's happening, I'm going to call it out. And I'm calling out what I'm observing. And you can try and obfuscate and try and soft pedal this and say, well, no, they're the religion of peace. And this is a good thing. And we need to welcome them and not be discriminatory against people of different religions. And he's like, I'm not saying any of that. None of what you just said is what I'm advocating. I'm not being xenophobic. I'm not saying we need to be intolerant of non-Christian, Judeo-Christian religions, obviously. What I'm saying is this is an existential threat to Western civilization. And
it's one thing if it's an idea. It's another thing if it's enacted.
Right. And all he's saying here is, here's an example of why this is not good.
So we got a comment here from Bill about militancy among Christians and onwards. And we've actually argued.
I can't keep up with Bill's comments. So which one?
Oh, I know. But I just thought this one was interesting because it intersects with what we're doing.
Yeah.
Which is that Christians are militant, but not physically. I mean, it's not a physical militancy. It's against false teaching. People take offense to that, though, because, words are violence now, of course.
Well, yeah, we're being judgmental and mean.
Right, exactly. And you're doing violence to people by telling them that they believe in something that's a falsehood, right? But so I understand maybe that's perceived as violence, but it's not. It's not. I mean, when did Christians fight for the faith? Like actually go to war? I guess you have the negative example of the Crusades.
If we just ignore Christendom, if we just push aside Christendom.
Yeah, so there was a pretty good chunk of history where it got confused. I would say. Well, I think we were confused.
I don't know. I think we're more confused now.
You think so?
Well, it's like I've talked about with chaplaincy. Chaplains fought alongside the soldiers. They carried a sword. And then the Geneva Convention said, no, not anymore. Sent them to the back.
Right, but they weren't fighting because they were Christians. They were fighting because their brother needed them to fight. Right. And they happened to be chaplains that would also preach to them.
And that's the distinction that needs to be made, I think.
Yeah.
Is that you can be a Christian and be a soldier. Or be a soldier and be a Christian. It involves repentance and forgiveness of sin.
Right,
but it's also the broader question of what does it actually mean to love your neighbor as yourself?
Well, and I would say when you want to talk about warfare, just to respond to that a little bit further, is as a Peter, that's very clear, right? We don't fight against one another. We fight against powers and principalities in the heavenly places.
Yeah. So
it's spiritual warfare, which people take personally, and they sometimes perceive it as an attack on them as a person. Right. But that's because they've identified themselves with their, what do you want to say? With their false belief, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah.
So.
Correct. Well, it's always emotional because, as I talked about in the book, I mean, our gods are projections of our emotions. So if you're going to attack someone's God, you are attacking their emotions, which is not reasonable. It's not logical.
Well, maybe that's the thing with this show, that probably it's not for everybody because, we allow Hitchens to kind of attack us here.
Yeah, why not?
It's like, yeah, why not?
What's he going to do? I'm a former atheist. What is he going to do? Convince me that I should be an atheist again? No.
Well, maybe it's not just about being strong in your faith, but like I said, it's willing to allow for criticism. You have to allow that criticism come along because it's iron sharpens iron, and the iron that sharpens is not always other believers. It's sometimes the unbeliever, right? Yeah. And just see if it holds up, right?
Right.
And if it doesn't, go search the scriptures again, talk to your pastor, read a book.
Right. Right.
Try to, see if you've got a better argument that you could make. Yeah. Maybe you can't make a great argument. Maybe it's one of these areas of paradox where.
Well, this goes back to the whole point of convenience and how convenient it is to be. Well, it was up until 60 months ago. It was just convenient to be religious. It was convenient. You could go to church, go to your mosque, go to your temple, whatever it might be, because it was easy to do. It was part of your schedule. Just an hour or two a week, whatever. And then it became inconvenient, and that's why churches and mosques and synagogues closed. and will never reopen. And a lot of people who had grown up their entire life in the church no longer go to church because they were given 16 months or a year, or however long, to think about a lot of different things. And one of the things they concluded is, I never really believed any of this stuff, and it just kind of went out of habit, and,
Yeah.
I don't really need it. I got other stuff. And, that's lamentable from the faith side of the street, salvation side of the street. But at the same time, at least they're being honest. At least they've searched themselves and stepped back and said, why exactly am I a part of this at all? Versus just going through the motions over and over again, not even believing in heaven or hell or judgment or Jesus or any of this stuff. Versus other people I've had come into this congregation who did some searching and self-reflection and came to the conclusion that they do believe, and they have, not only do they have questions about belief, they have questions about their Christian faith because they've been rattled. And and they do have doubt now, and they do have skepticism, and they are struggling with hopelessness and despair. Hopelessness.
We've had both kinds. We've had both kinds.
Exactly.
There's been a sifting.
Right. We're going through why Christians worship the way we do right now. And like I said yesterday, there's just some people who came in for the first time and they're like, what are we doing here? I'm like, we're talking about true and false worship. Yeah, but I was raised on the left side of the board and you're saying that's false worship. I'm like, yeah, I am. Well, how can you make that argument? Here we go. And at the end of the hour, you have people then saying either A, I disagree with you and I'm not coming back to Bible study, or I never even thought about these things before. I was never taught these things before. And now that you've shown them to me, I'm coming back because I want to have this conversation. I want to continue this conversation. Yeah. And what an atheist will do, or an agnostic, or just a person of a different belief system or philosophy, they will challenge your presuppositions and your confirmation biases and essentially compel you to either avoid them at all costs so you don't have to think about these things and talk about them, or ask questions like, do you even know why you do what you do?
Right.
Why you believe what you believe? Because if you don't, where's your faith located? Is it just believing in your ability to believe in something? Is it based on something outside of yourself? What is it based on? Is it emotionalism? Is it like he said, is it kind of like a safety net because you're insecure and in the face of reality, you just run to the lighthouse and say, well, I'm going to cling to this until things become clear for me?
Yeah. I think the thing that we had lamented a lot, and COVID actually, like we were just talking about, helped sift or kind of sort some of these things out, is how, to coin a phrase, how Laodicean, our churches are. We were studying Hebrews 12 in Bible study and talking about, running the race. But then at the end of that, it's interesting because he says, you got to watch out for each other. And because some of you are going to be like, like a lame arm or like, weak kneed or, because he's using that picture of the body of Christ being, a body running a race. Right. And you're only as strong as your weakest, member, effectively. Yeah. And for a long time, we were looking around and saying, we've got a lot of weak people. Yeah. Who, like you said, are going through the motions maybe, or they have all sorts of spiritual malady. They're not willing to talk. Right. And it's actually holding us all back. Right. And the naive understanding that we have as a church is that it's really just like all this individualism and it's just about me and God, that kind of thing. But that it didn't hold up to being locked at home for, 2 months.
Exactly.
Now we're seeing what we knew was true, but now it's most evident. It's like, I'm not sure why they were here in the first place. And nothing we said was getting through to them, and now we understand why. And of course, then we have to pray and lament and hope that. And
to be fair too, I have people that came back to the church that don't believe a word of what I'm saying, and they still come to church. So,
well, there's that too.
Because for them, they're like, you're just here to do this stuff for me, so don't get in my way. This is a thing, and I come to church so that I can worship. It's between me and God. Sure, after 13 years.
I just don't think that's going to hold up to attack.
Well, it doesn't for anybody under 60. How about that?
Okay, there you go.
In my congregation, and it's all boomers. And again, I'm not dogging on boomers. I'm just stating a fact. The only people in my congregation who torture themselves to just show up Sunday after Sunday and listen to what they don't believe are boomers. Because it's not what I was taught in confirmation. It wasn't what I was taught in Sunday school. That's not what my favorite pastor said, and I refuse to listen.
It's actually cultural indoctrination.
It's cultural indoctrination, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ouch.
Yeah. And yet I'll be like, hey, do you believe that the body and blood of Jesus are located under the bread and wine for the forgiveness of sins? Yes. Okay. Because that's an individual thing for them. When they come up and they're kneeling with everybody else, they don't care about anybody else at the rail. They only care about the fact that they're there. And they only care about what they're getting out of church. And so they come to church and they can just turn off their ears, ignore the sermon, tune back in, turn off their ears for the hymns they don't like, turn back on so they can tune in for the prayers, whatever.
No, they might complain to you about it.
No, never. They complain to my elders.
Oh, well, okay. I didn't
And then
make
my
a
elders
distinction there.
just say, well, good, you can go talk to pastor about that.
Good for them.
Exactly. Now my elders are awesome.
Well trained.
So some people, Hitchens says, some people say that without God, people would give themselves permission to do anything. You look at that case and see that with God, only with the view that God is on our side, can people give themselves permission to do things that otherwise would be called satanic. That's what this regime is like. I've seen it up close. Now, our greatest nightmare is about to occur, because even at its worst, I think Mr. Putin's regime is a cynical one. We are about to see in Iran a coincidence we have dreaded for a long time, that of a messianic regime with apocalyptic weaponry.
That turned out to be true, actually.
It actually did, and that's why a lot of European countries now are trying to take steps to push that out of their country. It is evidently looking for confrontation in secular society, everywhere, from Lebanon to Iraq. It feels it can fight and win, because it feels that a tooth fairy called the 12th Imam its Messiah.
Don't hold anything back.
Oh, goodness sakes. Okay. The 12th Imam, its Messiah, is about to return to them. And this is a fantastically dangerous, extraordinarily dangerous state of affairs. You know, that's actually, I never realized this before, and I've read the Quran, but that 12th Imam thing has a lot in common with Rastafarianism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And their belief in the return of the Ethiopian king.
Just less ganja.
Yeah. So therefore, not the coolest religion on the planet. To see what, by the way, I was listening to Bob Marley concert yesterday morning while I was getting ready for church. Mm-hmm. And for some reason, this is how genius this dude was in his music. I've never actually just taken a step back and thought about how many songs he wrote that are like, they're hits, right? They're not only just hits of the time, but they're like forever hits. Like every generation discovers Bob Marley, usually in college, right? And so like the Bob Marley's Greatest Hits CD is still on the top like 100, 200 Billboard charts.
I always listen to Exodus, but I don't.
It's like Dark Side of the Moon. Like it's just ubiquitous. If you're in college, you discover Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon, and Bob Marley, and a couple other things. But listening to the concert, then I'm like, this guy didn't write bad songs. Like his band never it's amazing that he's so good that you just take for granted that everything that he did was just like, oh, it's just Bob Marley. But like others have said, he ruined reggae music. Because no other Jamaican, not even Jimmy Cliff, like every reggae guy that comes out of, or reggae band that comes out of like Jamaica, they're like, Bob Marley. Like name another musician who systematically destroyed an entire genre of music by himself.
Okay, right now, Legend, the best of Bob Marley and the Wailers, is number 46 on the Billboard 200.
There we go.
I mean, Eminem's ahead of him, but
I'm just saying it's
Eminem greatest hits.
Like if there's a religion and there's a church I'm going to join, I mean, Rastafarianism, I mean, it's got some wacky stuff in there too, but I'm just saying, if you're going to go.
All right. So I'm looking here. Bob Marley, how many years, what did I say? It was 46. It's been on the charts for 149
years,
weeks. So the only one, 682. Sorry. Yeah. 682 weeks on the chart. Number 2 after that, it's 64 on the chart, is Journey's Greatest Hits.
Oh, yeah, that's another college find. Yes.
And then Metallica Black Album, 611 weeks on the chart.
Interesting.
Except right now it's at 182, so it's dropped. Guns N' Roses Greatest Hits, 533. Nirvana Nevermind is at 114, 528. This is interesting. Beatles 1. Was that the Greatest Hits? Was that a Greatest Hits?
Yes, I think so.
Oh, Creedence. Don't forget Creedence Chronicle.
Yeah. Of course, you discovered that in college too.
That's ahead of Bob Marley.
Here's my question to all Gen Xers. How many Gen Xers listen to Journey after a breakup with their girlfriend in college? How many
Queen.
Gen Xers got drunk after breaking up with a girlfriend and listening to Journey's greatest hits and singing Don't Stop Believin', Separate Ways, for sure, Separate Ways, but Wheel in the Sky, for sure, Wheel in the Sky. Screaming that in your dorm room.
Queen, greatest hits,
Of
number
course.
20 on the chart, and it's 442 weeks on the chart.
Yeah. I mean,
But Dark Side of the Moon, where is it?
in fact, during
dropped.
freshman orientation at college, they should just hand out a box of these CDs for you because you're going to get it. Well, obviously not CDs anymore because it's digital.
Well, back in the day with Columbia Music, whatever it was,
Yeah.
those were the ones.
Those were the days.
Oh, Purple Rain's still
Anyways.
on the chart, though. That's good.
The evils of Iranian theocracy. Sorry about that.
Okay.
We usually
up,
do this
stand
at the
up.
front end of the show, not at the back end, but there we are. I didn't have enough coffee. You don't need me to tell you about it. You see the messianic settlers on the West Bank trying to bring on the Messiah in their way and to bring about the end of days, another phenomenon that has become to us almost too familiar. Well, this is 1999 he's saying this, and it's...
Wasn't this like 2 weeks ago? Okay.
Yep, exactly. But it's like shootings in Chicago, right? It's just, you look at it, it's like, oh, Israel and
Another 50 over the weekend. Well,
yeah.
So it is.
Yeah, I guess they're killing each other again. I mean, the difference being that it's now public information that the United States government bankrolled, both sides. But just...
Yeah, but they stopped bombing because that was the treaty.
Yeah.
And instead they used incendiary balloons.
Right. Speaking of loopholes, here's a moral loophole. We'll send incendiary balloons over the wall.
The IDF did not agree that was a loophole.
Unbelievable. So here it is. Remember again, part of our charge against religion, our belief that it is, ironic, I bet you he used that on purpose. Our belief that it is fundamentally wicked and anti-human is precisely its eschatology. Religion is predicated on the idea that our time here is short and should be shorter, that our job is to bring on the end of days. That's a gross overgeneralization.
Mm-hmm.
This is just a veil of tears and guilt and shame. Ooh, veil of tears, that's in our catechism.
Mm-hmm.
This, the only life we have that contains music and art and literature and solidarity and sex and love, all of this should be swept away. Apparently, Christopher's been following the wrong religion.
Uh-huh.
Because it was actually the Christian church that sponsored all that music and art and literature and solidarity and sex and love.
Yeah, and look at the modern religion and its architecture and tell me that's worth, most of it's being, well, it was made out of concrete without steel, so it's being destroyed on its own.
That too, but it's hideous.
It's
I think
hideous,
we talked about this in the last podcast a couple times before, as an art school graduate, reflecting on even art up through the 90s. And then all of a sudden, I was just thinking about this one day. It's like, I don't hear poetry ananymore talked about or read.
Well, and everybody was like
music.
talking about the poet at the inauguration, the faux inauguration. And it was like slam poetry, and it's so good.
No,
and
it
like,
wasn't. It wasn't even good slam poetry. I mean, I like slam poetry. I'm not saying I do because I like rap, but I'm like, that was terrible. Like, no.
Well, it's because she was young and a girl in black. I hate to say it, but that's what it was.
Wow. She checked all the boxes.
And now she's poet laureate or something?
Sure.
Okay.
No. Get up and read Langston Hughes or read a Stephen Baldwin essay or something, but no, don't do that.
And so to your point, the things that he's saying that religion wants to destroy, these are the things that we as Christians embrace as being gifts from God.
Exactly.
And to be enjoyed and to be celebrated and to be supported.
Right. Well, I think what Hitchens does, and one is he assumes a lot into fundamentalist religions or the fundamentalist sects of religions. Like the Westboro Baptists are an easy target in the past for Christians, for example, or the religious right back in the 80s, or Iran and the extreme interpretations of the Quran by the regime in Iran, for example. But at the same time, too, recognizing, and he has done this, by the way, in other places, in articles and interviews. I've listened to him because even in his own book, he notes that when he travels, he will go to ashrams and temples and synagogues. He refuses to go into a church. That was the one thing he said, I will never set foot in a church, but I will go to synagogue. I don't believe it, but I want to honor these people's culture. And he sees it as a part of their cultural heritage, their religion.
Fair enough.
And he's like, yeah, as long as you're not up there talking about how we need to annihilate the people across the street of a different religion, I'm down with learning from you and talking with you about your faith, and I'll respect your beliefs as long as you're not Christian. So he acknowledges, even in his own biography, like, no, I'm down with going into religious buildings and talking with religious leaders and religious people in general, asking like, why do you believe this? And have you ever thought about these options? But he respects them. And so I think too, we also, not only Christian-wise, but we talk about this ideologically, like politically, just because someone votes a certain way doesn't automatically then make them a part of this monolithic block of people over here. And be like, well, okay, you voted for Biden or you voted for Trump. Therefore, everything that is associated with that politician, you're that thing. You're that person.
Or the other way around, because you're a Christian, you're a Republican.
Correct. Or, yeah, exactly. And we do that, though, because it's easier than thinking. Right? It's like
to just put people into boxes like that?
Correct. Yeah. Like that's, Carl Jung said, thinking is difficult. That's why we judge.
Well, and that's my problem with the Jungian archetypes is that no one fits any of the archetypes perfectly.
Perfectly right. Well, they're more of like a hook to put your hat on, just like history and dates in history. It's like it's just there to hang your hat on, but it's not there to like plant a flag on or build a house. It's simply just recognize like, oh, you're a warrior, you're a sage, you're an adept, you're different things in different periods of your life. So just be aware of that. You're going to go through stuff in this time of your life that's very similar to what other people have, but it's not fate that you have to be this way or you have to go through these things.
Well, and that's why I think you want to apply this to a science like medicine. It's like you don't approach any person as fitting some, you do a diagnosis and then they're right within that box. I think of that old show I enjoyed it a lot. It was House MD. It got a little bit long later on. Right, but the differential diagnosis is like to recognize that each person that comes to them anyway, and they were a specialty clinic, if they came to them, they're not fitting within the paradigm. It's not easily classified, and that they're going to have to do this whole differential diagnosis to figure out like how we treat this person effectively. Maybe they have something that's innovative and new, or maybe it's something we know about, but it's been misdiagnosed, or there's other symptoms that are masking, the actual symptoms that we need to treat. All this it's like that's actually medicine because it's an art.
Yeah,
it's not purely science. There's technique. There's art to it.
Exactly.
And because nobody is simple that way, right? And life isn't simple that way.
Right, but this is what we do, right? We categorize. We reduce everything to categories. It's human nature to do this, and this is the danger of dogmatism and systemizing everything. It's also what allows us to get trapped in these categories and talk about systemic racism or talk about dogmatism in a negative or positive sense, or
even the church, right?
Or the church, exactly. And recognize that the same people that will cast aspersions on the church will get upset if you do the same thing to them and their ideology, their group, their cause. And say, well, but in the past, your group did this. Well, that's not us anymore. We don't do that anymore. It's like, oh, but you can do it to me. It's like, my favorite is always like, well, what about the Crusades? It's like, yes, what about the Crusades? I wasn't there, so you tell me. It's like, well, Christians killed Muslims in the Crusades. I'm like, yeah, that's because the Muslims were killing the Christians before that.
Or Southern.
There's more than one.
Confederate, Southern Confederates that were Christians that had owned slaves.
Right.
Like, yeah, they did.
Yeah. I don't.
Well, right. I reject it. Well, yeah. But I'm not to blame for them.
Right.
They had their blind spot. I have my own blind spot, and I'm sure they have something you can blame me for.
Sure.
Right.
Like I said earlier, are you going to throw out all your Martin Luther King Jr. books and dismiss him outright because he was affiliated with communism and may have been a closet Marxist
and had other moral failings?
Moral failings. Are we going to dismiss him outright? Just get rid of him? It's like people do this with me with Malcolm X. I think a lot of what Malcolm X had to say is actually spot on. I agree with him more than I agree with Dr. King.
Or Shay.
Yeah, I'm not down with Shay anymore.
No. I saw somebody, she was a leftist, right? And she had a tattoo of him on her shoulder. I'm like, have you ever read any of what he wrote? I don't think you did. No. Because he's an icon and not.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Again, category. And it's branding. It's all branding, baby. And when we fall victim to this branding, this marketing, this is what we do. We just throw everybody in the box that they fit in because it's simpler than having to get to know them as a human being.
Methodists, Lutherans.
And this is the myth of humanism. The myth of humanism, the myth of progress is that we have to love everybody. We have to understand everybody. We have to accept everybody. It's like, I don't care about everybody.
Well, and I think we've seen it now is that we're supposed to also, well, there was a World Economic Forum video. This is not the one where you'll have nothing and you'll like it. But this was one where there'll be no race.
Correct.
So, right. So it's like everybody's going to intermarry and we're going to have all this kind of genetic diversity, which I don't have any problem with.
Right.
But to say that there's no races, I mean, that's kind of strange, and that there aren't separate cultures and different nationalities, and
right.
And why do we have to obliterate all of those distinctions?
Right.
Well, it's a globalist thing. It's also ultimately a well, God puts us into people groups. He gives children to families, and they're going to be distinct and unique within that family. And to try to destroy all the distinctions, actually to destroy the order that God sets up in creation, or at least the diversity. Really, diversity is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But then why would we want to whitewash that's ultimately what it is. Whitewash everything.
Yeah.
No. I don't think we need to do that. But then religiously, that ends up being part of it too, right?
Of course,
is that we actually have to
invention.
But we have to
invented it.
We have to level all the religious distinctions too.
Yes.
Well, everybody just love your neighbor. We all agree on that, and everything else we have to set aside, because that's going to be the golden rule is going to be our religion now.
Right. Exactly.
It's not going to work either.
Yeah.
All right.
So our charge against religion. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, for example, Geoffrey Fisher of all people, the man who's thought to be the head of the mildest church of the lot, a few years ago was discussing thermonuclear war. You would have thought, if I'd given you the quote blind, that it was some verminous mullah. So the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Geoffrey Fisher, head of the mildest church of the lot, which I tend to agree with, actually. This is what he said. The worst you could do would be to usher people sooner and in their millions into a higher form of life to which they are destined anyways, regarding thermonuclear war. These are the people who say that they lead a flock and who certainly look like sheep. How can you tell, by the way, from a religion that refers to its adherents as if they were sheep and its leaders as shepherds? But never mind that for now.
I'm just going to drop that one and move on.
Exactly. Eschatology is inseparable from religious faith. True. It wants this to come to an end. It seeks our destruction. It thirsts for it, and it sometimes plans for it. That's what's happening to us now. So I'm not happy at the way in which these clouds are gathering, not as in the corner of our eye, but increasing directly in our vision. And so rather than just leave you with a pessimistic thought, I want to leave you with one that I hope slightly pisses you off.
Ooh.
There we go. In Kata's speech last night from the literature table that I saw in the back, and in many of the conversations that I have had on the side here, I would have gotten the impression that we were all met here to tell Jerry Falwell to F off. That's not true at all. I don't think anyone's done much more than I have to rubbish the Christian coalition, to ridicule them, to oppose them, to trash them in their own heartlands, to denounce them in print. It's a necessary job, very important to do, but it's not the whole story.
He's so right.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
By the way, Gillespie and I are with Hitchens on this paragraph. Pretty. We're marching with him. Let's just put it that way.
Well, I will say this one thing, and I know he's not going to get there.
Yeah.
But I mean, we can say hindsight's 20/20, and we can look back and say, I think he's pointing the finger at the wrong religious ideology.
Correct.
I mean, there is an apocalyptic religious ideology. I don't think they propose themselves to be, but it is actually this progressive ideology that we can improve the human race. Ends up being, whatever you label you want to give it, transhumanism or this atheistic materialism. It is apocalyptic, whether they know it or not. I think that.
Did you see they published all that on the British government website now?
Which one?
I sent you the link on Instagram, but on the British government's website, they now have an entire section on transhumanism and how they're going to convert the human race and microchip everybody.
Right, and I mean,
it's on their website. They don't even hide it anymore. They're just like, yep, this is what we want to do. This is the plan.
Now, if they got the technology from the aliens that we're in correspondence with, that'll be revealed here. Oh, this week, right?
The audit's going to be, yeah.
No. Well, the audit's not until August. Results from the audit don't come from another month yet.
I thought it was the audit results.
No, this week is the UFO disclosure.
Oh, is that this week?
Yeah, that they're supposed to reveal the 25th, I think, is what they said.
Blue Beam? Yeah, Project Blue Beam.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
If we find out that all of this technology, the mRNA stuff is all about, implanting alien DNA and transcending humanity, well, then that'll be interesting.
Yeah.
Or it'll be apocalyptic.
I tell you what, though, I'll tell you this right now. If they did that, if the government came out and said, we want to inject you with alien DNA, like that would eliminate people's reluctance to get vaccinated. You would just
absolutely.
You would just chop off half of the resistors in a one fell swoop. Like, wait a minute, alien DNA? So I could be like Superman or something?
Beam me up, Scotty. Yeah.
You'd be like, yeah, sure. I'm like, inject me twice. Let's go.
I have no idea what the effect will be, but
don't care. Let's roll the dice on this bad boy. Yeah.
Never tried this one before.
Yeah.
Alien is better, by the way.
Yeah. So you have not really come out. You have not declared yourself bravely to be an atheist and to be defending civilization against clerical barbarism if all you have done is denounce some moon-faced Christian coalitionist or some burn-faced Jesuit child molester. Okay. That should be the elementary duty of a citizen. And many non-atheists are capable at least of doing that. Even other Christians, actually. No, in order to say you've taken on the battle, you have to say that you are taking on jihad, the most virulent, the most dangerous, the most evil, the most pernicious, the most systematic attack that secular civilization is currently facing. There it is.
The end.
The end.
I'm trying to get my head around this one.
That's not even a summary paragraph. You
Nope.
know? That's like something you say in the middle of a speech that you are then going to extrapolate upon. No, I'm going to leave you with this one. You're not a real atheist if. Which, by the way, in our tradition, a lot of people actually argue for us to preach sermons in exactly this style.
We'll just drop a bomb and walk away.
You're not a Christian if you don't do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm still going to assert what I said. I think he's onto the religious ideology and the way that it can be used to destroy civilization. I get that. But I think he's pointing the finger at the wrong place.
Correct.
So his diagnosis is correct, but his cure ends up being it ends up being the thing that actually destroys his argument.
Correct.
Because we've seen these things play out in real time. What it is to live apart from any sense of created order, right? And again, the apocalyptic vision is just, why are we always we're always into this, I guess, the end times. It's popular in fiction, it's popular in motion pictures. And maybe it is an interesting tension for Christians, right? Because we've criticized that in our own way in saying, the whole heaven is my home, but a stranger here is not helpful in its own way, right? Is that you don't avoid the life that you've been given now.
Well, it's a Platonic abstraction. It's not biblical.
Well, there's that problem too. But I just mean that that escapism. It's like, why would you escape the vocation that God has given you now, the life He's given you now? I mean,
correct.
One, enjoy it. Two, maybe make something of it.
Correct.
Because it's a blessing, and you can't know the future anyway. You can't know what that life, the eternal life, will be like. Is it going to be better? I don't even know that it's what's better about it?
Well, again, you're starting to assign moral categories, moral terms to something that's not moral.
Well, and I think that's the distinction, right? That we don't want to do, is to say that this life is inferior to the life to come in a moral capacity.
Things might be bad now, but they're going to be good in heaven.
Right, that whole categorical
That, by the way, is that whole pity thing that Nietzsche is constantly critiquing. Is the reason that Christianity is so loathsome is because it pities people, which reinforces bad habits, sin, if you want to call it that, selfishness, self-pity, self-centeredness, is rather than make this argument like, well, heaven's my home, so I'm just passing through, which is very Augustinian, by the way, who got it from the Neoplatonists. But the point is then that, again, you want to check your presuppositions and recognize, like with St. Augustine, lauding Augustine to be lauded and be like, yeah, you were really spot on with this one. Sometimes he's a little bit off, like with his whole adoption of the word sacrament to describe the mysteries of God, because we see how it played out historically. Not so helpful. But then there's other things he says where you're just like, dude, that's straight up from your reading of Cicero. Like, you're just taking from Cicero for this. And this is not helpful. Like his entire debate with Julian of Eclanum on the bound will. It's just two Ciceronian scholars arguing with each other who's got the better Ciceronian philosophy based on their quoting of the Bible.
Right.
And so, as Christians, a part of the freedom that we enjoy in Christ is the freedom to repent of going down the wrong path and saying, but by the grace of God go I, Lord have mercy.
Right.
And recognize that one of the things that we talk about so much in our readings is in the modern church, we have lost the language of instrumentality. Mm-hmm. Everything's about human agency. And then Jesus becomes either the play caller, he's like our life coach, some spiritual guru who just gives you instructions, and then if you carry them out successfully, you get to go to the Elysian fields or something. Or he's Santa Claus. He rewards good little boys and girls for being saintly and then punishes bad little boys and girls for being satanic. And you have again, Robert Capon, we've gone through this with Capon. All of these different tropes, all these different metaphors that aren't biblical, but we assign them to deity, we assign them to Jesus uncritically. And then when someone pushes back, we do what every tribe does, what every team does, which is we circle the wagons and we protect our own. But the problem is if you're protecting someone who's cancerous or is communicably ill, you're going to infect the entire population with this. And I think with eschatology in particular, right, when things are bad or you're in a crisis, whether it's personal or corporate, you want to look into the future and say, well, it's got to get better, right? It's got to get better. And not only is it going to get better in certain sects, but we can actually help move this along by taking agency and running the play. Versus, like my professor liked to say, the Holy Spirit comes from the future to tell us about the last day in the affirmative. So therefore, as Christians, we know, as baptized children of God, our hope is, the last day, we're just raised from our graves. We enter into paradise with Christ. It's a Genesis 2 kind of world. And that's it. We're good. And versus...
Well, there is that confession. Their works do follow them. Yeah. Which is not a matter of salvation, I don't think. I think it has to do with the fact...
Gospel of John.
Right. It actually is, that everything that we've learned in this life, we take with us in the life to come, right?
Sure.
So art, music, literature, beauty.
Yeah.
But maybe even in a greater way, but it's not as if this is a waste of time.
Right. There will be no music in heaven. No poetry.
No, I want to hear Bach do a cantata, right?
Right.
No,
right.
No, but I was thinking
that's the question in John's Gospel. Before we skip over it, is what is it? What are we? What is it to do the works of God? What must we do to do the works of God? And Jesus says, "Believe in the one whom He sent." Period. That's it.
Yeah.
What are the works that follow you into heaven? Well, it's either all your works, which mean nothing. They're a big pile of dreck.
In terms of salvation, sure.
In terms of salvation, or, well, I trusted you.
Right, but everything else comes along,
Correct.
And forgiven, purified or sanctified or whatever word. Right? Yeah.
That's what it means. To be righteous means God forgives, and to forgive in the Hebrew sense means God doesn't remember your sin. Yeah. So therefore, at the last day, there's nothing for God to remember of your sin. There's only the remember of His baptismal promise to you.
My point is that you aren't obliterated. Your identity isn't obliterated in the resurrection. Right. I mean, you still are who you are. Some of the relationships change, like marriage, etc. But it, you're still Donovan Riley.
Right.
The other thing, we've been pretty hard on utopianism. But we don't want to swing the other direction here,
right?
Which is to say, which is what Hitchens is criticizing, and become annihilationism or whatever.
Yeah.
We're not negative either. It's like when we talk about vocation, what we're trying to do is actually to see yourself in a way that's helpful, so that you can enjoy life, so you can enjoy what you've been given, right? You can enjoy the talents, the gifts that you have, or the people that you've been placed with. Right. And so that can actually be a joy, not a burden. Right. And is it ultimately perfect? Is it ideal?
Right.
No.
Right.
But it's also not like horrible and demeaning and needs to be everything destroyed. That's what I'm saying. Some of this has to carry forward into the resurrection. What's the point?
Let's take the example of the flood, actually. I think that's a good example because it's basically a model for the church. Noah doesn't just run around hitting people over the head with a club and dragging them into the ark and forcing them to be saved. He takes 100 years to tell everybody, hey, water's going to fall out of the sky. God said so. And everyone's like, no, it's not. That's never happened before. Water doesn't fall out of the sky. 100 years. Water's going to fall out of the sky. It's coming. It's coming. Just get on the boat. Just get on the boat. And everyone's
you have to build it too.
But you have to build it too. But again, it's like, hey, man, what are you doing? I'm building the ark. Still? Yeah, still. And there's no force. There's no force. There's no compelling people to get on. He simply says, this is what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then he closes the doors, and everyone's like, hey, let us in. And he's like, sorry, doors are closed. Water's rising. If I open the doors, we all die. Ain't happening. That's what the church's job is. That's the mission of the church. Get in. Because this is the proclamation of the church of the New Testament, that we live in the last days. And that's Peter's whole defense in 2 Peter 4, right? The people mock him. They're like, I thought you said Jesus was coming back. And he's like, he is, but God doesn't count time the way that you count time. So why are you doing it this way? And
yeah, you don't put your life on hold waiting for the resurrection.
Yeah, right, exactly. Because you've been given a vocation. And so as a consequence, rather than attempting to escape this life, you actually revel in this life and you bear the cross. 2 Peter.
Okay.
You bear the cross for the sake of the other, so that hopefully then God may use you to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ to your neighbor, that they might hear and be saved. Because faith comes through hearing, and hearing comes through the word of God, and you're an instrument of the word of God.
So while
vocation is preach.
That's what I was going to say. While we're going about our work, ultimately, still the goal is to be trained up in righteousness that is in Jesus, for the sake of salvation.
Yeah. What's your hope?
Right. And you can enjoy everything else if, I suppose, if you have that to look forward to.
Correct. Yeah.
So it's not this fatalistic destruction. I mean, there is a destruction in the last day. There's no way. We're not going to get around that. But we're not ushering it on. We're not trying to do it. We're not trying to destroy the world.
This is the difference between instrumentality and agency, though.
Okay.
One, I'm an instrument. Do with me as you will. The other is, tell me what the play is and I'll run it.
Yeah, we probably are the agents of our own demise, though.
No, I am, for sure. My wife would testify to that fact. Even my kids are like, oh, absolutely. No, he's his own worst enemy.
Right, but thankfully God uses that even as in an instrumental way to benefit others, even your own 100%. Self-destructive behavior.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that is the end of Christopher Hitchens' speech, the Emperor Has No Clothes Award speech, in front of the Freedom from Religion Foundation in 1999.
Pretty intense.
Pretty intense stuff. Definitely drinking from the fire hydrant if you're not used to Hitchens. And like I said, if you're curious about them, go check them out. And take the time. Challenge your own presuppositions. Have the conversation.
There's so much that you can watch and listen from him. And I think it's always engaging, even if you don't agree.
Yeah, he's a wit. He's a public wit.
Yeah,
he doesn't shy away from that. And he makes a lot of sense a lot of the time. He's a very logical person, at least he presents himself to be. But he's also a brand, and he knows that too. He's very open about that. It pays the bills for him. So,
and there's a limit to logic, as we said, right?
There is. He does an interview when he right before he died, because he died from cancer. He does an interview right before he dies. And that's very entertaining too, because the interviewer is basically saying like, okay, you're going to die, and let's talk about metaphysical questions. And he's like, okay. And they're like, well, have you questioned the existence of God since you've been diagnosed? No. Well, do you question what happens after you die? No. And he's, and this might be difficult for some people to understand or appreciate, but I appreciate and respect his commitment.
Yes, commitment to his unbelief. Yeah,
I do, because at least he stuck with it all the way through, and he didn't try and apologize for it.
In the same way that we appreciate people who say, "I just don't know."
Yeah, at least you own it.
I get that. Yeah, I get it.
You don't equivocate. You don't try and pull back. I get it. But praise God for those like my grandmother's husband, who at the end of his life repented and received the sacrament and died in the faith after a lifetime of being a solid brass bastard to everybody around him.
Yeah.
And actually, final thought from me, it was more difficult for the people in the church that day to accept that about him than it would have been if I had said he died a stone cold, abusive, alcoholic atheist. Because then at the very least, again, they have closure, and they have this sense of like, he died of cancer. He was an abusive alcoholic atheist. He got what he deserved. And now we can all go on with our life feeling good about ourselves because we're free of it. Versus on his deathbed, he actually called the pastor and asked to receive the Lord's Supper and repented and confessed his sins and received forgiveness. And people are like, no. He doesn't get to be let off the hook. That's not how this works. I'm like, actually, it kind of is. That's how the Holy Spirit runs. And again, for a person sitting here talking about, I'm one of the people he punched.
Yeah.
I'm one of the people he sent flying across a room. And I'm the one who was asked to give his eulogy. And so I did. I preached Christ crucified. I preached that whole thing. And then even the minister that was there that day refused to talk to me after the service and wouldn't even give me a ride to the cemetery for the committal. So I missed the committal.
Because you had the audacity to basically do what Jesus did for him, which is to not hold a sin against him.
Correct. And I didn't pull punches. I said straight up, I'm like, he's one of the meanest bastards I'd ever met in my life. He was an abusive alcoholic, and he was a bully, and he tortured his own family and everyone that ever came into contact with him. And then the gospel. And my grandma was overjoyed, because she's a woman of faith. And those in the church that had heard me before were like, yeah, this is what he does.
Well, it's as if the word is true. Love covers a multitude of sins.
Let's just say that Annie and I ate alone in the reception hall that day. So the church was full, by the way. The church was full for this funeral, but most of the people that were there at church were not there to celebrate his life or mourn him. They were there to basically make sure that he went in the ground. And I'm like, wow, there were a lot of people on Good Friday that were there to witness him being carried to the tomb. And they were glad he was put in the ground too.
Right. And I wonder what Hitchens would say about that, because that seems utterly unreasonable.
Well, of course it is. It's absurd.
Yeah.
It is absurd. But that's what we embrace. We embrace the absurdity of our faith because it's not a human invention. Therefore, it doesn't apply and doesn't facilitate itself to human logic.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, and this is a crux of it too, is we're not like medievals where we're like, well, God's just everything we're not. He's omni this, omni that. It's like, no, God became a man.
Right.
So that he's able to sympathize with us in every way because he was tempted like us in every way.
Well, and again, like Hitchens would say, it's unreasonable because it actually has no intrinsic value. And I think,
Correct.
But I think he's wrong on that.
Mm-hmm.
That the value of forgiveness for relationship, for community,
right,
really for this world. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he did talk about that. I can't think of a time where he did, but he talked about a lot of things.
I'll run down a research rabbit hole this week and look that up because, right, you and I probably both tell people the foundation of any good relationship isn't love, it's forgiveness. Mm-hmm. In Christ's name in particular.
Yeah, forgiveness in Christ's name is love, actually.
Right. That's what you and I would argue, whereas everybody's indoctrinated to believe, no, love. And you're like, what kind of love? The love that I had for you the first time I saw you, where all I could think about was how long is it going to be till I can put hands on this person? Or is it going to be the kind of love that I had the day that I got married, where I was like, I love her, but why in God's name am I doing this? Mm-hmm. Or the love that I had 3 years into our marriage, where I'm like, I got to get out of this. Or the love that I have for my wife today, where I'm like, I'd gladly give her any internal organ that she needs to live,
right?
Even if it took my own life.
So what I'm saying about, I would want Hitchens to engage not in a broad brush like he did in this article, but specifically with that unique, faithful Christian confession of forgiveness of sins in Christ's name. Now, what do you do with that?
Right.
And maybe you can't. Maybe it isn't so empirical. Maybe it is still hard to kind of get data from it.
Sure.
But I think you can probably give some anecdotes at least.
But I think the absence of a metaphysical conversation blunts and stunts that whole conversation. If there's no metaphysical reality, let's just take love. Like, where is love a biological accident so that we procreate? Like, is that the entire purpose of like the emotional feeling we have towards a member of the opposite sex? That's just a biological function that leads to procreation so we can further the race so we don't die. Is that all love is? That we call it love, but it's really just a biological accident?
I don't think he would say that because the article, he talked about love and beauty.
Because I was listening to something else last night on the same topic.
Yeah,
but that's what I'm saying is like, we're going to throw that one on the table and be like, is it an accident of nature, of evolution, or is it some other subjective expression? Is it objective? And why do we spend so much time? Well, we used to spend a lot of time on differentiating between different kinds of love. Or is there something more to the conversation about, because why did I fall in love with my wife? In particular, why did I fall in love with Annie and marry her? Because I fell in love with lots of women over the years, or at least, I thought it was love. And yet, when I first saw my wife, I had the exact same emotional reaction, biochemical reaction to my wife that I had to all the other young women that I had, bumped into during those years. And yet, the difference between the women that I dated who I wanted to be committed to but couldn't, and my wife was the first time I saw her, I knew I was going to marry her. I knew it. I knew it. And and it wasn't an emotional thing. I just saw her and I went, I'm going to marry her. It was just like so matter of fact. You could have like written it in the paper and I would have read it and be like, why her?
That'll work out. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And like I've said before, there's nothing about my wife when I first saw her that I would be attracted to. Like she didn't have any of the measurements or any of the things that I looked at in women and went, that's the woman that I want to date or I want to get to know her better.
In a platonic kind of way. Yeah.
In a platonic sort of way, sure. And yet here we are 23, 24 years later now. And is that just an accident? Or again, is it something objective outside of ourselves that binds us together, right? And if we can't even have that conversation on a metaphysical and let alone a physical plane, because like even now we can't really have a physical conversation because there's 5,386 genders and biology isn't real. So then again, thank you, postmodernism. We can't really even have like a physics-based conversation or debate because we can't have a metaphysical conversation or debate. And now he's running out of the room. But my point is then that for myself, and maybe you've run into this too, you who are listening, you can't even really have a conversation in just general terms about objective reality. Because that's really what it gets to at the end of the day is what I really want to have a conversation. And if he was alive, I'd like to talk to him about it is just to sit and say, hey man, talk to me about objective and subjective reality from your perspective. Like where are you coming at on these topics? And then once he lays it out for me, then say, okay, now let's talk about certain topics in general and then go from like love and then go from love to why do I love my wife and not other women? And just kind of have that conversation of, is this objectively or subjectively a thing? Is this love that we're discussing? Is this unique? Is it a trope? What is it? And then why specific people? And just have him break it down systematically for us, so that we can just follow the logic to its conclusion and then walk away and go, I don't agree with you, or maybe I do agree with you, but at least I now can walk through this and say, oh, I get this now. Like the whole show is premised on this, but it's like, tell us what you believe. But we can't really have that conversation. And what I'm encountering more and more, even with the boomer generation, is their inability to even talk about this kind of stuff. Because they don't have any premise to work from. There's no foundation to work off of. And so I'm constantly having to backfill. And like I said, after 13 years of constantly repeating and backfilling the exact same conversations, I realize they don't actually want to talk about this stuff. They just want to dismiss me or have me affirm what they already believe.
Well, and if you use that list from the speech, you know, how many people in your parish, I mean, I probably in your social circle, but in your parish are, you know, musicians and artists and writers. I mean, these things have, I don't know if they've been shut down intentionally, but they certainly been diminished. Is that, you know, the creative arts, the ways that we express the beauty of creation that God has, you know, put in our, you know, in our minds and our eyes. And architecture. I mean, we have this argument all the time with the church building. It's like, why don't we take care of it and make it, you know, and it's not necessary, but that's always the argument. It's not necessary. And like, well, why does it have to be necessary? Why can't we just do it for the love of it?
But here's the thing though, is that for you and I as Christians, this all comes back to the Alpha and the Omega of Jesus, that everything that we can know about God is located in the person of Jesus. And therefore, when we talk about beauty, we talk about art, we talk about music, we talk about all of this, whether it's the affirmation and acceptance or the rejection and the negation. As Christians, we're still out, the heart of the whole argument, the confession is Christ.
Yeah.
And the revelation, specifically the revelation to faith, that Christ is the wellspring from which all of these things come. So when we say church architecture isn't important, church music isn't as important as we make it out to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, what we're not addressing, because we're not digging to the root, is you're negating Christ. Because we're not starting, we're basically wagging, like it's the tail wags the dog kind of thing. It's like, rather than just address like from Christ issues, beauty, art, music, all of these things that we're inspired to do, or a rejection thereof, rather than just acknowledge that. It might sound childish and benign, but when you repent, for example, of your sin, you're repenting of blues music, jazz music, any music that doesn't proclaim Christ Jesus, because that's the whole reason that music exists, is to proclaim the glory of God in Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And as a Christian, you embrace that dichotomy because you recognize that music is beautiful, and people singing about being human, breaking up with a loved one, being betrayed, yearning, violence, all these things that are encompassed by art and music, for example. You're embracing that this is a part of being a sinner, actually. Like blues and jazz is just like, here's what original sin sounds like. And yet to us original sinners, it's awesome, right? And so people will ask me this question, for example, is like, I like metalcore and deathcore when I'm sparring in Muay Thai. And people are like, but you're a Christian. I'm like, yeah, I don't actually, like, nothing that they're singing is like, I don't believe in any of that stuff, and I can't really understand half of it anyways. I just need the blast beat, and I need that music for when I'm sparring because it helps me get in the right mindset.
In a Dionysian kind of way.
In a Dionysian sort of way. And the fact that I'm fighting while listening to it is doubling down on that. And so when I come before the altar of the Lord on Sunday morning, after having done all that, I don't hold that outside of my repentance. I don't be like, well, but I do it for a good reason. It's so I can, protect my family and defend myself. No.
Self-justify, yeah.
No, the fact that I live in a sinful world is the entire reason that I practice Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu. It's the whole reason I fight. It's the whole reason I do anything. So I'm not negating the fact that I live in a sinful world and I'm a sinner, and therefore I'm going to exclude this part of my life because I like it, and therefore God likes it. No.
But
Exactly.
What about the Lutheran metal masses?
Yeah, exactly. Again, I don't care about the musicality as long as it confesses Christ. It may not be your cup of tea, but you know what? I can't stand high church.
Right. Well, listen, if you've only got an hour of daylight, in the winter, I can understand
that too.
Metal.
Yeah, it makes it kind of makes you surly and somber and dark. But I'm just saying, like Kenneth Corby, Lutheran professor and pastor, made this comment about liturgy, is that he would go to Notre Dame in Paris with his wife to a mass and weep at the liturgy, but he would never in 1,000 years ever dress up like that or conduct liturgy the way that they did it. He was black cowboy boots, big buckle, very workman, show up, do your job, go home, do your job, read it out of the book. But he appreciated the beauty of Notre Dame Cathedral and the Mass and the.
Well, there's a time and place. I think that's part of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what we end up doing is, well, let's argue about the musical accompaniment versus what are they confessing.
I don't know what the metal Lutheran Mass is. I haven't looked at
that's an aesthetic thing. Again, I'm not down with it either because that's not.
Well, I'm just not into a band standing in front of the altar.
But I am also, Steve is on this thread, so Steve will attest to the fact that before the sermon, I punched myself in the face several times while facing the altar. So that's a little metal, I guess. But I'm just saying is that you can get caught up in that chronological snobbery, liturgical snobbery, whatever you want to call it. Even the snobbery of being in love. And not recognize that it's snobbery because it's you and it's personal to you and you prefer this aesthetically. And therefore it is what is right and good and true and salutary because it involves you. And then, but the thing, what happens is you can be standing in the dirt under a palm tree in another country where they don't have vestments and they don't have a cathedral. They just have a makeshift altar, and we gather around this in faith to confess Christ as Savior. And it is as far removed from Notre Dame or even my congregation on Sunday morning as you can get. And yet for someone like me, I wish I could burn my church to the ground and just have worship on the dirt with a makeshift altar sometimes. Because to me, and this is just a personal taste, it's honest and true and real, which are all Platonic categories, by the way.
Well, this happened to us because we're without an organist frequently this summer. And so we just sang a cappella, I just used a pitch pipe, started it, and we just started singing. We did just fine. There's no problem.
Yeah.
And we're like, but we need the organ, people will say. I'm like, no, you don't. You did just fine without it. Like, maybe there's some things that we really wouldn't sing because the organ helps us along. I don't know, it's not as familiar or whatever, but it's just a tool. It's just a tool.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it more beautiful, probably, but
right.
Is it necessary? No.
Yeah.
No.
Exactly. So start with Christ, end with Christ, if you're a Christian, and then pray that he reveal to you the truth. about himself, about God's will, and about salvation, about your vocation, about freedom that we enjoy in Christ. And don't be afraid to recognize that sometimes God sends atheists to reveal our false idols to us so that we might see Christ pure and true.
Yeah, and I think that's helpful, right? Because he is diagnosing,
correct,
this whole idea of like, well, all religion's the same, which even Christians fall into.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you fail to see that if you don't make that distinction that we preach Christ and him crucified for the forgiveness of sins, you're going to miss what actually, you're going to miss everything.
Yeah. So thank you everybody for listening. Thanks, Melody. Appreciate that. And to all the Misfit Toys who join us, thank you. And we'll be back next week for a brand new atheist.
No, we won't.
Oh, that's right. You'll be on vacation next week. So
yeah, I'm going to take a week off.
Good. And I'm not taking a week off until the weekend of the 10th. So you'll take a week off. No, actually, we won't be around for 2 weeks then because I'm off the week after you.
Wait a minute. Next week's the 28th. Then we have the 5th. Then it's the 12th.
Okay, so yeah, so we will have a week in between. So it'll be you, we'll be gone. Then we'll do a couple episodes. Then I'll be gone. It's July.
Yeah, that's
it's
fine.
Gonna be July. So just roll with it, baby.
It's summer.
So thanks everybody. Thanks for listening. Go check out everything at 1517. As always, check out the books, the blog, the videos. Go donate at 1517. Donate all that you do to support this in our organization. We truly appreciate and love you for it. Otherwise, we will talk to you next week. Peace. And then, I just said it. We'll talk to you next week, so you can chop that off. Just chop that off.
You said it.
I did.
You said it.
Yeah, that's been I show up for church without a tab on yesterday, but I buttoned up and I forgot to put a tab on. I go through all Bible study, nobody says anything. I could turn around, do the invocation, nobody do everything. Nobody says anything. I get to the collect and I'm like, something feels weird. Something's not right. And I reach up and I'm like, I'm not wearing a tab. So during announcements after service, I'm like, hey, just to put it out there, if you want to love your neighbor, if you see your pastor walking to church without a tab on, you can say something. It's cool, rather than just let me stand up there with my shirt buttoned up to my throat like a serial killer. I'm like, just like, hey, pastor, why don't you wrap that thing up?
Not passive aggressive, no.
Yeah, just hey, pastor, what's up with the collar thing? And they're like, and you know what they said? Two people are like, we just thought you were, it was for effect. We thought you were just, it was just the next step.
Kind of like if I left my fly down, right?
Yeah, I'm like,
just
no,
for effect.
No, don't do that. Don't do that to me. No. I may have brought that up. I'm like, if you see that I'm unzipped, if you see that my tab's not there, if there's something on the leg of my pants, just, hey, pastor, don't know if you noticed, but you're missing a tab.
I'm not trying to be provocative here.
No, I don't. I'm not like posing as a Mormon. I'm like going door to door. Like, come on, man.
Come on, man.
I can't. I said that during the Voyeurs meeting. I'm like, I was dying from a kidney infection for like the last month before we finally figured out what's wrong with me, and nobody said anything. I'm like, I was losing my mind, and everyone's like, he's going through a rough time. And now I already told you, like, if you see something, say something. No. Now we just thought you were doing it for effect. I'm like, I could drop dead of a massive heart attack at the altar, and you people would just continue singing to him. Be like, oh, this is probably part of the sermon. He's still like this illustration. I know he's doing here. They'd find me the next Sunday. They'd be like, oh, he might really be dead.
I mean, I might say you're training them well, but I don't know.
Yeah, right? Anyways, it's all good. It's all money.
All right, I'm going to end the broadcast.
End the podcast, the live stream.